What would you do if saving someone's life cost you everything you owned? Tonight, I'm sharing a story about a young man who made an impossible choice on a dying frontier, a choice that destroyed his future in one night and rebuilt it in ways he never imagined. This is a tale of sacrifice, hidden power, and the dangerous price of kindness in a world that rewards only the ruthless. Stay with me until the very end to discover how one decision at dusk changed an entire valley forever. And please, hit that like button and comment with your city name so I can see how far this story travels across the world. The sun was dying over Redstone Hollow, bleeding orange and crimson across a sky that seemed too vast for such a small, forgotten town. Dust hung in the air like the ghost of better days, settling on wooden boardwalks that creaked with age and neglect. The trading post stood at the center of what passed for civilization out here, a weathered building with peeling paint and a sagging porch that had seen more departures than arrivals in recent years. Ethan Cole stood in that dust, his boots worn through at the heels, his shirt patched so many times the original fabric was hard to identify. 19 years old and already wearing the exhaustion of a much older man, he carried the last delivery of the day strapped to his borrowed horse, a mare that belonged to his employer, a man named Garrett, who measured kindness and profit margins and loyalty in completed tasks. "You're late," Garrett had said that morning, his voice like gravel scraping metal. "Henderson's expecting those supplies before nightfall. You missed that deadline. Don't bother coming back for your wages. Or your things." Ethan had nodded, said nothing, because what was there to say? He lived in a storage room behind Garrett's barn, slept on a pile of empty feed sacks, and earned barely enough to keep himself fed. Late meant fired. Fired meant homeless. Homeless meant joining the growing number of drifters who passed through Redstone Hollow like tumbleweeds, rootless and going nowhere. The delivery would take him 6 miles east to the Henderson Ranch, a ride that needed to happen now, immediately, before the sun finished its descent and left him navigating treacherous terrain in full darkness. He checked the straps 3 times, watered the horse, and was preparing to mount when he saw her. She sat on the trading post porch like a discarded piece of furniture someone had forgotten to bring inside. An elderly woman in a dusty gray dress that might have been fine once. Her silver hair unpinned and wild, her eyes searching the street with a confusion that bordered on panic. People walked past her. Not around her, past her. As if she were invisible or inconsequential, or both. Mrs. Chen from the boarding house hurried by with her market basket, eyes fixed forward. 2 cowboys from the Broken J Ranch clomped up the steps, spurs jingling, and stepped over her outstretched feet without acknowledging her existence. Even Pastor Michaels, who preached charity every Sunday with theatrical passion, glanced her way and kept moving, Bible tucked under his arm like a shield against inconvenient compassion. Ethan watched this parade of indifference from beside his horse, one boot already in the stirrup. The sun was lower now, painting long shadows across the street. Every minute he delayed was a minute closer to failure, to unemployment, to losing the little he had. The woman's lips were moving, he realized, talking to herself or to people who weren't there, or to the ghosts of memories she couldn't quite grasp. Her hands trembled in her lap, fingers working against each other in distress. Not your problem, Ethan thought, the voice in his head sounding suspiciously like Garrett's. You can't save everyone. You can barely save yourself. He pulled himself up onto the horse, gathered the reins. The mare shifted, ready to go. The woman looked up then, directly at him, and their eyes met across the dusty space between them. Hers were blue, faded like old denim, but sharp underneath the confusion. Intelligent eyes trapped in a moment they couldn't navigate. "Please," she said, the word barely audible over the evening sounds of the town. I can't remember." Ethan sat frozen in the saddle, every instinct screaming at him to ride away. He was already late. The sun was already setting. His entire fragile existence depended on delivering these supplies on time. But those eyes, that word, please. How many times had he said that word himself? Please give me a chance. Please let me work. Please don't throw me out. Please see me as something more than disposable labor. He'd said it so many times that it had become almost meaningless, a reflex rather than a real request. But hearing it from someone else, someone clearly lost and frightened and ignored by an entire town, It hit different. It reminded him of what that word actually meant, a desperate hope that someone, somewhere, might choose to care. The decision happened before he was fully aware of making it. Ethan swung down from the saddle, his boots hitting the packed earth with a soft thud that felt like the sound of something breaking, maybe his future, maybe just his fear. He tied the horse to the post and walked up the porch steps. "Ma'am," he said, keeping his voice gentle, the way he'd talk to a spooked animal. "Are you all right?" She looked up at him with such relief it was almost painful to witness. I'm trying to remember. I came to town for something. Supplies? Or was it? No, I can't." Her voice wavered, frustration mixing with fear. "I should know this. I always know." Ethan knelt down so he wasn't looming over her, his knees protesting the movement. Up close, he could see details that made the picture more complex. Her dress, though dusty, was well made, the kind of quality that spoke of money, or at least the memory of it. Her hands, despite their trembling, bore no calluses, no signs of hard labor. A silver locket hung at her throat, tarnished but expensive. "That's all right," Ethan said, though it wasn't all right at all. Not for him, not for his deadline, not for the future he could feel slipping away with every passing second. "Can you tell me your name?" She thought about this, her brow furrowing with the effort of reaching through fog. "Lydia," she said finally, the name arriving like a gift. Lydia Harrow. The name meant nothing to Ethan, but he nodded as if it did. "Miss Harrow, do you live here in Redstone Hollow?" "No." This answer came quicker, more certain. "Up in the mountains. The ranch." "I have a ranch." "Can you remember how to get there?" Her certainty crumbled. The road goes up, past the... There are trees, big trees, and a creek that... No, 2 creeks. Or is it 3? Her hands started trembling harder. "Why can't I remember? I've lived there for..." "It's okay," Ethan said, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. She was real and solid and completely dependent on whatever he decided to do next. "We'll figure it out." "We." He'd said "we," committing himself before he'd thought it through. Behind him, the sun touched the horizon. Time was running out in multiple directions at once. Ethan stood and looked around the street, hoping for someone else to step up, to take this burden off his shoulders. But the street was emptying as people retreated to their homes for supper, for rest, for all the small comforts that came with stability and belonging. He could run inside the trading post, find someone to take responsibility. But he'd watched that parade of indifference, seen how easily people could make someone else's crisis invisible. By the time he convinced someone to help, if he could convince anyone, how much more would Lydia deteriorate? How much more frightened would she become? And underneath those practical concerns was something harder to articulate. A bone-deep exhaustion with a world where the vulnerable were treated as inconveniences. He was so tired of watching people look away. He was tired of being one of the people they looked away from. If he helped her, he'd lose his job. That wasn't a possibility. It was a certainty. Garrett didn't make idle threats. If he helped her, he'd lose his room, his few possessions, his foothold in a town that already barely tolerated his presence. If he helped her, he'd be exactly what Garrett always said he was. Too soft for the frontier, too sentimental for survival. A boy playing at being a man and failing at both. But if he didn't help her, if he just rode away toward Henderson's ranch and his deadline and his meager wages, he'd lose something else. Something that didn't have a price tag but felt more valuable than all of it. The ability to look at himself without flinching. "Miss Harrow," Ethan said, making his voice steady even as his future collapsed around him. "I'm going to help you get home. Can you ride a horse?" She looked at the mare tied to the post, and something shifted in her expression. A flash of the person she'd been before confusion had claimed her. "I've been riding since I was 4 years old," she said, a note of pride breaking through the fog. "Good," Ethan said, though nothing about this was good. "Then let's get you home." He helped her stand, supporting her elbow as she found her balance. Her legs were unsteady, but she moved with the muscle memory of someone who'd walked with purpose for decades, even if that purpose was temporarily lost to her. Getting her onto the horse required patience and several attempts. The mare, bless her steady temperament, stood perfectly still as Lydia struggled to coordinate her movements. Finally, she was seated, her hands finding the saddle horn with automatic familiarity. Ethan untied the delivery supplies and set them on the porch. Garrett would have his head for that too, abandoning goods, risking theft or damage. But there was no room for both the supplies and Lydia's safe journey home. He swung up behind her, reaching around to take the reins. This close, he could smell lavender water and dust, could feel how fragile her frame was despite that flash of pride. "Which direction?" he asked. Lydia pointed toward the mountains, dark shapes rising against the dying light. "Up," she said. "Always up." It wasn't much to go on, but it was all they had. Ethan guided the mare away from the trading post, away from the town, away from his deadline and his job, and the last shreds of security he'd managed to cobble together. Several people watched from doorways and windows, their faces showing mild curiosity, but no concern, no offers to help. He'd remember those faces later, would remember how easy it was for people to watch someone ride toward ruin and do nothing to stop it. The road out of Redstone Hollow climbed immediately, winding between rocks and scrub brush that grabbed at the mare's legs. The sun was gone now, leaving only the purple-gray light that preceded full darkness. In maybe 30 minutes, they'd be navigating by moonlight alone. "There's a fork," Lydia said suddenly, her voice clearer. "Past the old Miller place. Take the left branch." "The Miller place," Ethan repeated, watching the road ahead. "I'll look for it." They rode in silence for a while, the mare's steady gait eating up ground despite the increasing slope. The valley spread out below them, Redstone Hollow's scattered lights beginning to appear as lamps were lit against the gathering dark. Somewhere down there, Henderson was waiting for supplies that wouldn't arrive. Somewhere down there, Garrett was probably already planning how to replace his most disappointing employee. "You're very kind," Lydia said, her voice drifting back to him. "Most young men wouldn't have stopped." "Most young men have something to lose," Ethan replied, then immediately regretted the bitterness in his tone. This wasn't her fault. But Lydia chuckled, a surprisingly robust sound. "Oh, I doubt that's true. Kindness and poverty aren't related. I've known plenty of poor people with generous hearts and plenty of wealthy people with none at all." She spoke with the confidence of someone who'd observed the world extensively, which made her current confusion all the more jarring. Here was a woman who clearly had lived a full life, accumulated knowledge and opinions and memories, all of it temporarily locked away behind fog she couldn't penetrate. "Do you have family?" Ethan asked. "Someone at your ranch who's probably worried about you?" A long pause. There was no family, just the ranch, the land. That's been enough." The sadness in those words settled over them both like the cooling night air. Just the ranch, just the land. A life measured in acres and water rights instead of children and grandchildren. They found the fork Lydia had mentioned, marked by the ruins of a homestead that must have been the Miller place. Collapsed walls and a stone chimney pointing at the stars like an accusing finger. Ethan guided the mare left, up a narrower trail that climbed more steeply. "How much farther?" he asked, though he suspected she didn't know. "I'm not sure," Lydia admitted. "The roads all look different, like I'm seeing them for the first time, but I know it's up. We keep going up." So they climbed. The moon rose, nearly full, casting silver light across a landscape that grew increasingly wild and remote. Trees closed in around them, the big trees Lydia had mentioned, towering pines that turned the trail into a tunnel of shadow and filtered moonlight. Ethan's mind kept circling back to the consequences awaiting him in Redstone Hollow. By now, Henderson had surely sent word to Garrett about the missing delivery. By now, his few possessions, a spare shirt, a worn Bible his mother had given him, a broken pocket watch he couldn't afford to fix, were probably being thrown into the street. He'd saved 73 cents in a tin hidden under his bedroll. That was gone too, either kept by Garrett as compensation or stolen by whoever found it first. 73 cents. Nearly 2 months of careful saving, of skipping meals and wearing clothes until they were more patch than original fabric. Gone. All of it gone because he'd stopped for a confused old woman nobody else would help. "There," Lydia said suddenly, pointing ahead. "The creek. We cross it 3 times. I remember now, 3 crossings. and then the road levels out. Hope sparked in Ethan's chest. If she was remembering, maybe the journey wouldn't be as long or as complicated as he'd feared. Maybe he could get her home and still make it back to Redstone Hollow before morning, could somehow salvage something from this disaster. They crossed the first creek, the mare picking her way carefully over smooth stones. The water was running low this late in the season, barely deep enough to wet the horses' fetlocks. "My father bought this land," Lydia said, her voice taking on a storytelling quality, as if she were reading from a book of memories that had suddenly opened. 1847. People thought he was crazy, too remote, too rocky, not enough water. But he saw what they didn't. He saw the elevation, the springs higher up in the mountains. He knew water would always flow down. "He was right?" Ethan asked, glad to hear her talking coherently, even if it was about the past rather than the present. "He was brilliant," Lydia said, and Ethan could hear the smile in her voice. "Bought up all the land around the springs, secured the water rights before anyone else understood their value. Within 10 years, every rancher in the valley was paying him for access to that water." The second crossing came into view, this one slightly deeper, the water moving faster over a rocky bed. The mare balked for a moment, then stepped forward when Ethan urged her on. "And you inherited all that?" Ethan asked. "I built on it," Lydia corrected, and now there was steel in her voice, the fog clearing further. "My brothers wanted to sell after father died. Thought they could take the money and make fortunes in San Francisco or Denver. I bought them out, every acre. Took me 20 years to pay them back, but I did it. The land stayed whole." There was pride in those words, but also something else. Loneliness, maybe. The price she'd paid to keep her father's vision intact had apparently been measured in family ties broken, in choosing land over blood. They rode in silence for a while longer, climbing steadily. The third crossing appeared, and beyond it, just as Lydia had said, the road leveled out into a high mountain valley. And then Ethan saw it. At first he thought the moonlight was playing tricks on him, but no, there were structures ahead, large ones, solid and well-maintained, barns that dwarfed anything in Redstone Hollow. Fencing that ran in straight, purposeful lines, corrals that could hold hundreds of horses, and at the center of it all, a house. Not a cabin, not a homestead, a house. 2 stories, maybe 3, with a wide porch wrapping around at least 2 sides. Windows that caught the moonlight and reflected it back like dark mirrors. Chimneys rising from a roof that showed no signs of neglect or disrepair. "This is your ranch?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is home," Lydia said simply, as if the sprawling estate before them were the most natural thing in the world. Ethan felt something cold settle in his stomach. This wasn't just a ranch. This was an empire. They approached the main house, and lights began appearing in windows. Someone inside had heard the horses approach. The front door opened, and a man stepped out onto the porch, holding a lantern high. "Miss Harrow?" the man called, his voice tight with worry that shifted immediately to relief. "Thank the Lord. We've had riders out searching for you since sundown." And 2 more people emerged from the house, a younger man and a woman in her middle years, both dressed too well to be simple ranch hands. "I'm fine, Thomas," Lydia said, her voice carrying the natural authority of someone used to being obeyed. "Just got a bit turned around in town. This young man was kind enough to help me home." Ethan dismounted and helped Lydia down, his mind still trying to reconcile the confused elderly woman from the trading post porch with the owner of this vast property. Thomas, who had the bearing of a ranch foreman or estate manager, hurried down the steps to support Lydia's other arm. Up close, Ethan could see the genuine concern in his weathered face, the relief that bordered on devotion. "You shouldn't have gone to town alone," Thomas said gently, the way one might scold a beloved but stubborn child. "We've talked about this, ma'am. If you need something, just say the word and we'll fetch it." "I'm not an invalid," Lydia replied, but there was no heat in it. She was tired, Ethan realized. The journey had cost her something, even if she'd never show it. The woman from the house approached with a shawl, draping it over Lydia's shoulders. "Let's get you inside, Miss Harrow. I've got tea ready and some supper kept warm." But Lydia resisted being moved, turning to look at Ethan with those sharp blue eyes that had cut through her confusion to really see him. "This boy rode for hours through the mountains to get me home safely. I don't even know his name." "Ethan, ma'am," he said, suddenly aware of how he must look, dusty, poor, wearing clothes that marked him as the bottom rung of frontier society. Ethan Cole. Well, Mr. Cole, Lydia said formally, I owe you a debt of gratitude. Thomas, make sure this young man is properly compensated for his trouble. Set him up in the guest quarters for the night. It's too late and too dark for him to ride back now. No, ma'am, that's not necessary, Ethan said quickly, uncomfortable with the idea of accepting payment for basic human decency. I'm just glad I could help. But Thomas was already moving toward him with purpose. Miss Harrow's right, son. These mountain roads are treacherous at night, and your horse needs rest even if you don't think you do. Come on, I'll show you to the bunkhouse and get you some food. Really, I should, Mr. Cole. Lydia's voice stopped him cold. Despite her earlier confusion, despite her age and fatigue, she radiated authority. When someone offers you genuine hospitality, accept it graciously. You've earned rest and a meal. Don't insult us by refusing. Ethan found himself nodding before he decided to agree. There was something about her, a force of personality that made resistance feel not just futile, but somehow impolite. Thomas led him away from the main house toward a large building that turned out to be a bunkhouse far nicer than anywhere Ethan had ever lived. Clean, well-built, with real beds instead of piles of feed sacks. You can stable your horse in the barn, Thomas said, pointing toward a structure that was probably bigger than Garrett's entire operation. There's feed and water inside. Then come back here and I'll get you sorted. The barn was immaculate, lined with stalls that could hold dozens of horses, most of them currently occupied by animals that made Ethan's borrowed mare look like a child's pony. He unsaddled her, brushed her down, and made sure she had everything she needed, still trying to process what he'd stumbled into. When he returned to the bunkhouse, Thomas had laid out a plate of food that made Ethan's mouth water. Real beef, potatoes, beans, fresh bread. The kind of meal he usually only imagined. Eat, Thomas said, sitting across from him at the long table. Then you can tell me how you ended up riding Miss Harrow home from town. Between bites, Ethan explained. The trading post porch, the confusion in Lydia's eyes, the decision that had cost him everything waiting back in Redstone Hollow. Thomas listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When Ethan finished, the older man sat quiet for a long moment. You gave up your job to help her? Thomas said finally. It wasn't a question. Wasn't much of a job, Ethan replied, though that was a lie. It had been everything. Still, Thomas studied him with the same sharp assessment Lydia had shown. Most men wouldn't have made that choice. They'd have ridden past, same as everyone else apparently did. Ethan didn't know what to say to that, so he focused on his food. How much were you making? Thomas asked. With this employer of yours? $4 a week, Ethan admitted, plus room and board. He didn't mention that the room was a storage space, and the board was usually whatever scraps were left from Garrett's meals. Thomas made a sound that might have been disgust or sympathy or both. And you were headed where when you stopped? Henderson Ranch, 6 miles east of town, had a delivery that needed to arrive before nightfall. Which obviously didn't happen. No, sir. Thomas stood, moved to a cabinet, and pulled out a small wooden box. From it, he extracted several bills, more money than Ethan had seen in months. This is for getting Miss Harrow home safe, Thomas said, laying the money on the table. Ethan stared at it. $20. More than a month's wages from Garrett, sitting there like it was nothing. I can't accept that, Ethan said, though every practical fiber of his being screamed at him to take it and run. You can and you will, Thomas replied firmly. Miss Harrow would have my hide if I let you leave here without proper compensation. Besides, you lost your job helping her. Consider this a bridge while you figure out what's next. What's next? As if there were any good options waiting for him in Redstone Hollow. Ethan's hands trembled slightly as he reached for the money, folding the bills carefully and tucking them into his shirt pocket. It felt like more than payment. It felt like a judgment, a validation that the choice he'd made hadn't been completely stupid. Get some rest, Thomas said, moving toward the door. Breakfast is at sunrise. We'll get you set up to ride back to town after that. But as Thomas reached the door, he paused, turned back. For what it's worth, son. What you did tonight. That kind of character is rare. Don't let this world beat it out of you. Then he was gone, leaving Ethan alone in the bunkhouse with his thoughts and a full stomach and $20 that felt both like salvation and like the smallest possible compensation for everything he'd lost. He lay down on one of the real beds, staring up at the ceiling, his mind refusing to settle. By now, Garrett had probably rented out his storage room to someone else. By now, his few possessions were scattered or stolen or burned for all Ethan knew. He had $20 and nowhere to go. He had no job and no prospects. He had made a choice that any rational person would call foolish, had sacrificed his fragile stability for a stranger, and despite the money in his pocket, he felt the weight of that choice pressing down on him like a physical thing. But underneath all that worry and uncertainty was something else, something he couldn't quite name, a strange sense of rightness. He'd seen someone who needed help, and he'd helped. Simple as that. In a world that seemed designed to punish kindness and reward selfishness, he'd chosen kindness anyway. Maybe that made him a fool. Maybe it made him something else entirely. Outside, the mountain night was full of sounds. Wind through pine trees, the distant call of an owl, the settling noises of a ranch this size made as it prepared for sleep. Ethan closed his eyes, exhaustion finally claiming him. He didn't know it yet, but the choice he'd made on that trading post porch had set something in motion that would reshape not just his life, but the future of the entire valley below. For now, though, he slept the dreamless sleep of someone who'd walked through fire and emerged on the other side, scarred but whole, with nothing left to lose and everything yet to gain. Dawn broke over the mountains with the kind of crystalline beauty that made hardship feel almost worthwhile. Ethan woke to unfamiliar comfort, a real mattress beneath him, a roof overhead that didn't leak, silence instead of Garrett's pre-dawn bellowing. For one disoriented moment, he forgot where he was and why he was there. Then memory crashed back like cold water. The trading post, Lydia's confusion, the long ride into darkness, and the impossible estate that had materialized at the end of it all. He sat up, his body protesting the previous night's ride with a symphony of aches. Through the bunkhouse window, he could see the ranch coming to life, men moving between buildings with purpose, horses being led from the barn, smoke rising from what must be a cookhouse. The scale of the operation became even more apparent in daylight. This wasn't just wealth. It was power made tangible in wood and stone and carefully maintained prosperity. A bell rang somewhere, and within minutes men began filing into the bunkhouse, ranch hands, by the look of them, dressed for a day's labor. They nodded at Ethan with friendly curiosity but didn't press him with questions, which he appreciated. In frontier towns, asking too much about a stranger's business was considered poor manners at best and dangerous at worst. Thomas appeared in the doorway, looking as if he'd already been up for hours. "Morning, Cole. Breakfast is ready if you're hungry." The cookhouse was a separate building, large enough to feed what Ethan estimated must be at least 30 men. Long tables filled the space, and at the far end a kitchen setup that would put most town restaurants to shame. The food being served made last night's meal look modest. Eggs, bacon, flapjacks, fresh cream, coffee that actually smelled like coffee instead of burnt chicory. Ethan filled a plate, still uncomfortable with such abundance, and found a seat at the end of one table. A man about his own age sat down across from him, extending a hand. "Name's Samuel," he said. "You're the one who brought Miss Harrow home last night?" "Word travels fast," Ethan replied, shaking his hand. "Not much else to talk about out here," Samuel said with a grin. "Besides, Miss Harrow getting lost in town, that's concerning. She usually sharp as a tack. Thomas has been worried about her lately, though he won't say it outright." "She seemed confused," Ethan admitted. "Couldn't remember how to get home, but once we started riding, bits came back to her." Samuel nodded slowly. "She's getting older. Happens to everyone, I suppose. Just harder to watch when it's someone like her. Someone who's always been so—" He searched for the word. "Formidable." Before Ethan could respond, Thomas called from the doorway. "Cole, when you're finished, Miss Harrow would like a word before you head back to town." The food in Ethan's mouth suddenly tasted like sawdust. He'd assumed he'd collect his horse and slip away quietly, avoiding any awkward goodbyes or further charity. But of course Lydia would want to see him. She seemed like the type who tied up loose ends properly. He finished eating quickly, thanked the cook, and followed Thomas across the yard to the main house. In daylight, the building was even more impressive. Freshly painted, with architectural details that spoke of careful design rather than simple frontier construction. Window boxes held flowers that somehow thrived despite the elevation and the season. The porch boards didn't creak. They'd been maintained too well for that. Thomas led him through a front door that opened into an entrance hall that belonged in a city mansion, not a mountain ranch. Polished wood floors, a staircase that curved upward with actual craftsmanship, paintings on walls that displayed real skill rather than amateur efforts. "Wait here," Thomas said, disappearing through a doorway. Ethan stood in the hall feeling like a smudge of dirt on a clean page. He'd brushed off his clothes as best he could, but there was no hiding what he was. A broke ranch hand wearing poverty like a second skin. "Mr. Cole." Lydia's voice drew his attention to the doorway. She stood there transformed from the confused woman of last night into someone who radiated composed authority. Her hair was pinned properly, her dress was immaculate, and those blue eyes held no trace of fog. "Please, come in." The room she led him to was clearly an office. A massive desk covered with ledgers and papers, shelves lined with books and maps, a window that overlooked the ranch with a view that probably encompassed thousands of acres. Lydia settled into the chair behind the desk with the ease of long habit, gesturing for Ethan to sit in one of the chairs opposite. "I trust you slept well?" she asked. "Better than I have in months, ma'am. Thank you." "And Thomas compensated you appropriately?" Ethan shifted uncomfortably. "Very generously. Yes, ma'am." Lydia studied him with an intensity that made him want to look away, but somehow didn't permit it. "You're uncomfortable with the money." It wasn't a question, but he answered anyway. "It feels like too much for just doing what anyone should have done." "But no one else did," Lydia countered. "That's the point, Mr. Cole. The trading post was full of people who saw an elderly woman in distress and chose convenience over compassion. You chose differently." "I just couldn't leave you there," Ethan said simply. "Why not?" The question was sharp, probing. "You said yourself last night that you had a deadline, a job depending on that delivery. You knew what helping me would cost you, so why not leave me for someone else to deal with?" Ethan thought about how to answer that, how to put into words something he didn't fully understand himself. "I guess I've been that person before. The one everyone walks past. I know how it feels to need help and watch people decide you're not worth their time. I couldn't do that to someone else." Something shifted in Lydia's expression, a softening around the eyes that suggested he'd said exactly what she'd been waiting to hear. "Thomas tells me you lost your job by helping me, that you were working for a man named Garrett, living in his storage room for $4 a week." Heat crept up Ethan's neck. Hearing his circumstances stated so plainly made them sound even more pathetic. "Yes, ma'am. And now you're heading back to Redstone Hollow with $20 and no prospects." "I'll figure something out," Ethan said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "There's always work somewhere if you're willing to do it." Lydia leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled in front of her. "Tell me about yourself, Mr. Cole. Where you're from, how you ended up in Redstone Hollow." It wasn't the dismissal he'd been expecting, but it also wasn't an offer of further help. Just curiosity, maybe, or the kind of polite interest wealthy people sometimes showed before sending you on your way with a clear conscience. "Not much to tell," Ethan said. "Grew up in Missouri. Parents had a small farm, but my father died when I was 15 and my mother a year later. Farm went to debts. I've been working my way west ever since, trying to find a place to settle." "Why west?" "Because east was full of memories I didn't want to carry anymore." Lydia nodded, as if this made perfect sense. "And you've been doing ranch work?" "Whatever work I could find. Ranch hand, stable boy, freight loader, farm laborer. I'm not particular as long as it's honest." "Are you good with horses?" "Good enough. I can ride, care for them, train them if they're not too far gone. My father taught me that much before he died." "Can you read and write?" The question surprised him. "Yes, ma'am. My mother was a school teacher before she married. She made sure of that." "Mathematics?" "Basic figures, yes. Enough to know when I'm being cheated, anyway." A small smile played at Lydia's lips. "That's more education than most ranch hands can claim. What about your character, Mr. Cole? Are you honest?" "I try to be." "Try isn't the same as are." Ethan met her eyes directly. Then, yes, ma'am, I'm honest. I don't steal, I don't cheat, and I pay my debts when I can. Sometimes being honest has cost me work because employers don't always want to hear the truth about their operations or their decisions, but I can't seem to help myself. Do you drink to excess? I don't drink at all, can't afford to, and I've seen what it does to men who can't control it. Gamble? No, ma'am. Why should I believe any of this? The question was blunt, almost aggressive. You're a stranger who showed up with a good story. For all I know, you could be a drifter looking to take advantage of an old woman's gratitude. The accusation stung, but Ethan kept his voice level. You shouldn't believe it, ma'am. You should ask around Redstone Hollow about me, verify everything I've said. You'll find I'm exactly what I appear to be, a broke nobody who made a stupid choice and is now paying for it. But I won't lie to you to make myself look better. The silence that followed felt like a test. Lydia watched him with those sharp eyes that seemed to see straight through whatever defenses he might have constructed. Finally, she spoke. Last night, when I was confused and lost, do you remember what I told you about my father? Yes, ma'am. About buying the land around the springs, securing the water rights. What I didn't tell you, Lydia continued, is that my father wasn't just smart about land and water. He was smart about people. He used to say that you could learn everything you needed to know about a man's character by watching what he did when there was no benefit to doing right and every reason to do wrong. She stood, moving to the window, her back to Ethan as she looked out over her empire. I wasn't entirely lost last night, Mr. Cole. The words hung in the air like smoke. Ethan felt his stomach drop. I have my moments of confusion, that's true, Lydia continued, still facing the window. The fog comes and goes, and I'm not fool enough to pretend otherwise, but last night I was aware enough to know where I was and what I was doing. I sat on that porch for 2 hours, Mr. Cole, watching, waiting to see if anyone in that town still had a shred of decency left in them. Ethan couldn't find words. His mind was reeling, replaying the entire previous evening through this new lens. 27 people passed me, Lydia said, her voice carrying the weight of disappointment. People I've known for years, people whose parents benefited from my father's water agreements. People who've prospered because my ranch provides employment and stability to this entire valley. 27 people saw me sitting there, obviously distressed, and not one of them stopped. Not one. She turned to face him, and her expression was fierce. Until you. A boy with nothing, who had everything to lose, who stopped anyway. Not because you knew who I was or what I owned, but because I was a human being in need. You were testing them, Ethan said slowly. Testing us. I was testing what's left of humanity in Redstone Hollow, Lydia corrected, and finding it sorely lacking, except for you. But you really were confused, Ethan protested, about the roads, about getting home. That wasn't an act. No, Lydia admitted. Once we started riding, the fog came back worse than usual. The fear was real, Mr. Cole. The confusion about the trails was real. But the initial decision to sit on that porch and see who would help? That was intentional. Ethan didn't know whether to be angry or impressed. That's a dangerous game, ma'am. What if no one had stopped? What if I hadn't come along? Then I would have made my way home eventually, and I would have learned a very depressing truth about the town my father helped build. She moved back to her desk, but didn't sit. But you did stop. And in doing so, you answered a question I've been asking myself for years. What question? Whether there are still people in this world who choose right over easy. Whether kindness still exists in places where it costs something real to offer it. She paused, her gaze intense. My father built this ranch on smart decisions and hard work, Mr. Cole. But he also built it on the belief that good character was worth more than gold. He chose partners and employees based on that principle, and it served him well. I've tried to do the same, but good character has become increasingly rare. I'm not sure what you're getting at, ma'am. Lydia pulled a ledger from her desk, opened it to a page marked with ribbon. This ranch encompasses 42,000 acres. We maintain water rights to 17 separate springs and creeks. We employ 38 men full-time and another dozen seasonally. Our annual revenue last year was just over $93,000. The numbers were staggering. Ethan had never heard of that kind of money outside of railroad barons and mining magnates. I'm telling you this, Lydia continued, because I need you to understand the scope of what I'm offering. I'm 73 years old, Mr. Cole. I have no children, no living relatives who give a damn about anything except dividing up my property when I die. This ranch, everything my father built and everything I've maintained, will eventually pass to lawyers and distant cousins who will sell it off in pieces to the highest bidders. Ma'am, I don't. She held up a hand, silencing him. Unless I can find someone worthy of carrying on what we built, someone with character, intelligence, and the willingness to put the land and the people who depend on it above personal gain. The implication of her words hit him like a physical blow. You can't mean I'm offering you a position, Mr. Cole, not as a ranch hand, but as an apprentice of sorts. You'll work alongside Thomas, learning every aspect of this operation: land management, water rights, contracts, negotiations, personnel. It will be hard work, harder than anything you've done before. But if you prove yourself capable and trustworthy, you'll have a future here, a real future, not just scraping by on $4 a week. Ethan's mind struggled to process what he was hearing. Why me? You don't know me. One decent act doesn't make me qualified to. One decent act, when it costs you everything, shows me more than 100 letters of recommendation from people trying to impress me, Lydia interrupted. I've spent 50 years dealing with men who tell me what they think I want to hear, who present themselves as upstanding citizens while cheating their partners and abusing their workers. I've become quite good at seeing through facades, Mr. Cole, and what I see in you is exactly what this ranch needs. But I'm 19 years old. I don't know anything about managing an operation this size. You're 19 and honest and willing to sacrifice your own interests for a stranger's welfare. That's more than can be said for most men twice your age. She closed the ledger with a decisive thump. I'm not offering you control of the ranch tomorrow, Mr. Cole. I'm offering you the chance to learn, to prove yourself, and perhaps, many years from now, to take over stewardship of something that matters. What you make of that opportunity is up to you. The room felt too small suddenly, the weight of possibility pressing down on Ethan like physical pressure. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't happen to people like him. What if I fail? He asked. What if I'm not smart enough or capable enough, or then you'll have failed trying to build something meaningful instead of succeeding at mere survival, Lydia said. That's still a better life than working for men like Garrett. She had a point. Even if he somehow managed to fail spectacularly, he'd be no worse off than he was now. Worse, actually, because right now he had $20 and no job prospects at all. I need an answer, Mr. Cole. My offer comes with conditions. You'll live here on the ranch, in the bunkhouse, with the other men until you've proven yourself worthy of better quarters. You'll work longer hours than you've ever worked, learning not just physical labor but the business side of ranching, contracts, water law, land management, everything that makes this operation sustainable. You'll report directly to Thomas, who will not go easy on you simply because I've taken an interest in your future. And you'll conduct yourself with the honesty and integrity you showed last night every single day, even when it's difficult. What's the pay? Ethan asked, then immediately felt foolish for asking. But Lydia smiled. Direct. I appreciate that. Room and board plus $8 a week to start. As you take on more responsibility, that will increase. If you're still here in 5 years and have proven yourself indispensable, we'll discuss a percentage of profits. $8 a week, twice what Garrett had paid him, plus real room and board, and the chance to learn skills that could actually build a future. It wasn't even a difficult decision. I accept, Ethan said, and I'll work harder than anyone you've ever employed, ma'am. I promise you that. I don't want promises, Mr. Cole. I want results. Show me through your actions that my faith in you isn't misplaced. She extended her hand across the desk. Welcome to Harrow Ranch. Her grip was surprisingly strong, her skin weathered but steady. Ethan shook her hand, sealing an agreement that felt far more significant than a simple employment contract. Thomas will get you set up properly, Lydia said, releasing his hand. He'll assign you quarters, explain the operation, and start your education. Listen to him, Mr. Cole. He's been with this ranch since before I inherited it, and there's nothing about this land he doesn't know. Yes, ma'am, I will. And one more thing. Her voice stopped him as he turned toward the door. What you learn about my occasional confusion, my moments of fog that stays between us and the people who already know. I won't have rumors spreading through the valley that I'm losing my faculties. Is that understood? Completely, ma'am. Good. Now go. You have a great deal to learn. Ethan left the office in a daze, finding Thomas waiting in the hallway with an expression that suggested he'd been listening through the door. "So, she made you the offer," Thomas said. "You knew she was going to?" "I suspected. Miss Harrow has been talking for years about needing to find someone worthy to carry on her father's legacy. She's tested a lot of men, hired them, watched them, waited to see if they'd prove themselves. None of them lasted. They were either too greedy, too lazy, or too stupid to understand what she was building here." "And you think I'll be different?" Thomas started walking, leading Ethan deeper into the house. "I think you already proved you're different by stopping last night when no one else would. Whether you can learn the rest, that's up to you. But I'll tell you this, Miss Harrow doesn't make offers lightly. If she sees something in you worth cultivating, it's there. You just have to be willing to do the work to develop it." They passed through rooms that spoke of decades of accumulated wealth, not flashy or ostentatious, but solid and carefully maintained. Everything in the house seemed built to last, chosen with thought and purpose rather than mere display. "This way," Thomas said, leading him back outside and across the yard toward a different building than the bunkhouse where Ethan had slept. "You'll have your own room now that you're permanent staff. Nothing fancy, but it's private and it's yours." The room was small but clean, a real bed, a chest for belongings, a window that looked out toward the mountains. After months of sleeping in Garrett's storage room, it felt like luxury. "Get settled," Thomas said, "then meet me at the main barn in 30 minutes. We'll start with the horses. Figure out what you actually know versus what you think you know." True to his word, Thomas spent the rest of the morning testing Ethan's horsemanship. Not in a cruel way, but with the systematic thoroughness of someone who needed to establish a baseline. Ethan groomed horses, mucked stalls, demonstrated his riding skills on 3 different mounts, and showed how he'd handle a Greenbroke colt that was testing boundaries. "You weren't lying about knowing horses," Thomas admitted as they broke for lunch. "Your form could use work, and you've got some bad habits we'll need to break, but the foundation is solid." The afternoon brought a different kind of education. Thomas took him on a tour of the property boundaries, explaining the water rights that made the ranch viable. "See that creek?" Thomas pointed to a stream winding through a valley below them. "That's Spring Creek. Flows year-round because it's fed by snowmelt from the peaks. Miss Harrow's father bought the land around its source back in 1847, which means we control the water rights. Every ranch downstream has to negotiate with us for access." "That seems like a lot of power," Ethan observed. "It is, which is why how we use that power matters. Miss Harrow's father could have squeezed every ranch in the valley dry, charged whatever he wanted for water access. Instead, he set fair prices and honored his agreements even when he could have gotten more, built trust instead of resentment. That's why this ranch has lasted when others have failed. People know we deal honestly." They rode for hours, Thomas pointing out boundary markers, explaining easements and shared grazing agreements, detailing the complex web of relationships that kept the ranch operating smoothly within a larger community of ranchers and farmers. "You need to understand," Thomas said as they headed back toward the main buildings, "this isn't just about managing land and livestock. It's about managing relationships, keeping your word, and thinking 10 years ahead instead of just focusing on next season's profits. That's what separates a good ranch from a great one." By the time they returned, Ethan's head was swimming with information. Property lines and water law and grazing rotation schedules and 100 other details that he'd never had to consider as a simple ranch hand. Dinner that night was another communal affair in the cookhouse, but this time Ethan noticed things he'd missed that morning. The way the men talked about the ranch with genuine pride rather than just viewing it as a paycheck. The absence of the bitter complaining he'd heard from workers at every other place he'd been employed. The sense that people here felt valued rather than merely used. Samuel sat down next to him again. "So Thomas had you out riding the property?" "All afternoon. My head's full of information about water rights and boundary agreements that I'm going to spend all night trying to remember." "That's how he works. Throws everything at you at once to see what sticks. Don't worry about remembering it all right away. You'll ride those same boundaries 100 times before you're done learning them. How long have you been here? Ethan asked. 3 years. Came out from Pennsylvania thinking I'd make my fortune in the silver mines. Ended up broke and desperate in Redstone Hollow. Miss Harrow was in town buying supplies, heard me asking around for work, and offered me a trial position. Been here ever since. You like it? Best job I've ever had, Samuel said without hesitation. Fair pay, good food, honest treatment. Miss Harrow runs this place like she actually cares whether we live or die, which is more than I can say for most employers. And Thomas is tough but fair. He'll work you hard, but he'll also teach you things that make you more valuable. You picked a good place to land, Cole. The evening passed with more conversation, men sharing stories about difficult cattle drives and encounters with mountain lions, and the time a spring flood nearly wiped out the lower pastures. Ethan listened more than he talked, absorbing information about the ranch's culture and expectations. Later, lying in his new room, Ethan stared at the ceiling and tried to process everything that had happened in less than 24 hours. Yesterday morning, he'd been a broke ranch hand living in a storage room. His entire future depended on making a single delivery on time. Tonight he was employed on the most prosperous ranch in the valley, with a room of his own and the possibility of a real future stretching out before him. All because he'd stopped to help a confused old woman on a trading post porch. Except she hadn't been confused, not entirely. She'd been testing him, testing everyone, looking for exactly the quality he'd demonstrated without knowing he was being observed. The thought should have made him angry, should have felt like manipulation. But somehow it didn't. Lydia had been searching for character in a world that seemed to have misplaced it, and she'd found what she was looking for in the least likely place. The weeks that followed tested Ethan in ways he'd never imagined. Thomas proved to be a relentless teacher, pushing him through lessons that began before sunrise and often didn't end until the stars were bright overhead. Learning to manage a ranch this size wasn't just about hard work. It was about thinking strategically, understanding systems, seeing how a single decision could ripple out across thousands of acres and dozens of lives. One morning in late October, Ethan was in the main barn checking on a mare about to foal when Thomas appeared with a ledger tucked under his arm and an expression that meant business. "Leave that," Thomas said. "Samuel can handle the mare. You're coming with me to town." Ethan wiped his hands on his trousers and followed Thomas to where two horses stood saddled and waiting. They rode in silence for the first mile, the morning air sharp with the promise of winter. Finally, Thomas spoke. "We're meeting with Jacob Henderson today. He owns the ranch where you were supposed to deliver supplies the night you helped Miss Harrow." The name hit Ethan like a fist. I remember. He's been refusing to pay his water access fees for the past 3 months. Says the rates are too high, that Miss Harrow is taking advantage of her position. I've sent him 2 notices. He's ignored both. "What do you want me to do?" Thomas glanced at him. "I want you to watch. Learn how these negotiations work. Henderson's a bully who thinks he can intimidate his way out of his obligations. He can't, but he'll try. Pay attention to how I handle it." Redstone Hollow looked exactly as Ethan remembered it. Tired buildings clinging to relevance, dust settling over dreams that had long since faded. They rode past the trading post where everything had started, and Ethan felt a strange disconnect, as if that night belonged to someone else's life. Henderson's ranch sat east of town, exactly where Ethan had been headed that fateful evening. It was a modest operation compared to Harrow Ranch, maybe 1,500 acres, a dozen head of cattle, buildings that needed repair. As they approached, a man stepped out onto the porch, his arms crossed and his face set in hostile lines. Jacob Henderson was a thick man in his 40s, with the kind of permanent scowl that came from years of blaming the world for his own failures. His eyes flickered over Ethan with brief curiosity before settling on Thomas with open contempt. "Figured you'd come yourself eventually," Henderson said. "Sending letters like some fancy lawyer wasn't getting you anywhere." Thomas dismounted with calm deliberation, and Ethan followed his lead. "Mr. Henderson, I believe you know why we're here. I know you're trying to squeeze money out of honest ranchers who are barely scraping by. You're 3 months behind on your water access fees," Thomas said evenly. "That's not squeezing. That's collecting what you contractually agreed to pay." "Contractually." Henderson spat the word like it tasted bad. That contract was signed when water was scarce and you people had us over a barrel. Times have changed. There's been plenty of rain this year. I don't need your overpriced water." Thomas pulled the ledger from under his arm and opened it to a marked page. "According to our records, you've drawn water from Spring Creek 17 times in the past 3 months. If you don't need our water, why do you keep using it?" Henderson's jaw tightened. "That creek runs through my property. I got a right to use it." "The creek runs through your property, but the source is on Harrow land, which means we control the water rights. You know this, Mr. Henderson. Your father signed the original agreement with Miss Harrow's father in 1851. You've been paying the fees without complaint for 15 years. Why stop now?" "Because I'm tired of making rich people richer while I can barely feed my family." It was a rehearsed line, Ethan could tell, the kind of appeal to sympathy that probably worked on people who didn't know Henderson's actual circumstances. But Thomas didn't bite. "Your financial difficulties are unfortunate," Thomas said, "but they don't absolve you of your legal obligations. The access fees are due. If you can't pay the full amount immediately, we can arrange a payment plan. But the debt must be settled." Henderson's face darkened. "And if I refuse? Then we'll file a claim with the territorial court, and a judge will decide. That process will cost you far more in legal fees than you owe in water access, and the outcome is certain. The contract is ironclad. You'll lose, Mr. Henderson. The only question is how much it will cost you to learn that lesson." The threat hung in the air between them. Ethan watched Henderson's expression shift through anger to calculation to something that looked like desperation. "I don't have 3 months' worth of fees right now," Henderson admitted finally, his voice lower. "Business has been hard." "Then we'll arrange terms," Thomas said, his tone softening slightly. "You can pay half now and the rest in 60 days. But this is a one-time accommodation, Mr. Henderson. If you fall behind again, we won't be as flexible." Henderson looked like he wanted to argue further, but the fight had gone out of him. He nodded curtly. "Fine. Give me a minute to get the money." He disappeared into his house, leaving Thomas and Ethan standing in the yard. Thomas caught Ethan's eye and gave a slight nod, a silent instruction to stay quiet and keep watching. When Henderson returned, he carried a small leather pouch that he handed to Thomas with obvious reluctance. Thomas counted the money carefully, then made a notation in his ledger. "This covers half of what you owe, plus this month's current fee," Thomas said. "The remaining balance is due by December 15th. If you need an extension beyond that, send word before the deadline. Don't make us come looking for you again." Henderson nodded, his face bitter but resigned. As they rode away from the Henderson ranch, Ethan waited until they were out of earshot before speaking. "He really couldn't pay?" "He could pay," Thomas said. "He just didn't want to. Henderson's problem isn't poverty. It's poor management and poor judgment. He spends money on whiskey and gambling that should go to his operation. But that's not our concern. Our concern is making sure he honors his agreements." "You could have pressed harder, demanded the full payment." "I could have," Thomas agreed. "But what would that accomplish? Henderson knows he's in the wrong. Making him choose between feeding his family and paying his debts would only breed resentment. This way, he pays what he owes, we maintain the relationship, and everyone moves forward." "So it's about more than just the money." It's always about more than just the money," Thomas said. "That's what you need to understand, Ethan. This ranch doesn't exist in isolation. We're part of a community, part of a network of relationships that have been built over decades. Miss Harrow's father understood that. He could have crushed every small rancher in this valley, could have monopolized the water and forced everyone to sell out to him. Instead, he charged fair rates and honored his agreements, which meant people trusted him. That trust is worth more than short-term profit." They rode in silence for a while, Ethan absorbing the lesson. Finally, Thomas spoke again. "You noticed something back there, didn't you? When Henderson mentioned his father signing the original agreement, he said 1851. Miss Harrow told me her father bought the land in 1847. That's right. 4 years to secure the land, build the infrastructure, and establish the water rights before he started signing access agreements. That's the kind of long-term thinking that built this ranch. Not quick profits, not taking advantage when you have leverage, strategic patience, and fair dealing. By the time they returned to Harrow Ranch, it was late afternoon. Thomas sent Ethan to help with the evening feeding while he went to update Miss Harrow on the Henderson situation. Ethan was hauling hay to the livestock when Samuel found him. "Thomas said you went to town. How'd it go?" "Educational," Ethan said, tossing another bale over the fence. "Watched him collect a debt from a man who didn't want to pay." "Henderson? You know about that?" Samuel nodded. "Everyone knows. Henderson's been complaining to anyone who'll listen that Miss Harrow is robbing him blind. Most folks know better than to believe it, but he's vocal enough that the story gets around." "Does that kind of thing happen often? People refusing to pay?" "Less than you'd think. Most ranchers around here understand that the water access is what keeps them viable. They might grumble about the fees, but they pay. The ones who don't usually have other problems, debt, drinking, bad business decisions, Henderson's got all three." That evening, Ethan was summoned to Miss Harrow's office again. He found her sitting in her usual chair behind the desk, looking tired in a way that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. "Thomas tells me you accompanied him to the Henderson ranch today," she said without preamble. "Yes, ma'am. He thought I should see how debt collection works." "And what did you learn?" Ethan thought carefully before answering. "That power isn't just about having leverage. It's about how you use it. Thomas could have destroyed Henderson today, but instead he gave him a way to settle the debt without losing everything. That showed more strength than crushing him would have." Something in Lydia's expression softened. "You're learning. Good. Because there will come a time when you have to make similar decisions, and the easy choice will always be to use whatever power you have to maximum effect. The harder choice, the right choice, is to balance what you're owed against what crushing someone will cost the larger community." She stood, moving to the window as had become her habit during their conversations. "My father once told me that a ranch this size is only sustainable if the valley around it is healthy. If we impoverish our neighbors, we impoverish ourselves. It's a lesson too many powerful people never learn." "Henderson called the water fees excessive," Ethan said. "Are they?" Lydia turned to face him, and he saw approval in her eyes at the question. "They're fair market rates based on the actual cost of maintaining the infrastructure that delivers the water. We review them annually against comparable access fees in other regions. Could we charge more? Certainly. We control a resource that every rancher in this valley needs to survive. But doing so would violate the principles my father established, and it would eventually destroy the community that makes this ranch valuable." She returned to her desk, opened a drawer, and pulled out a thick document. "This is the original water rights agreement my father drafted in 1849. Read it when you have time. You'll see that he built in protections not just for the ranch, but for the users. Caps on fee increases, dispute resolution procedures, guaranteed access even during drought years for ranchers who'd paid their fees. He was thinking 50 years ahead, building a system that would outlast him." Ethan took the document carefully, feeling the weight of history in the yellowed pages. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because you need to understand what you're being trained to protect. This isn't just about acres and cattle and water rights. It's about a vision of how business can be conducted ethically, how power can be wielded responsibly. If I'm going to trust you with this ranch's future, you need to understand its foundation." The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door. Thomas entered, his face grave. "We have a problem," he said. "Fire at the Dawson Ranch. Started about an hour ago in their main barn. They're asking for help." Lydia stood immediately. "How bad?" "Bad enough that they're asking neighbors for assistance. Could spread to their house if they can't contain it." "Gather everyone," Lydia ordered. "Every able man. Get the water wagon loaded. Ethan, you're coming too." Within 20 minutes, a dozen men from Harrow Ranch were riding hard toward the Dawson property, a wagon loaded with water barrels rattling behind them. Ethan rode beside Samuel, who explained as they went. "The Dawsons have been ranching here almost as long as the Harrows. Good people, but they've had a string of bad luck. Lost half their herd to disease last year, had a drought damage their hay crops. A barn fire could finish them." They smelled the smoke before they saw it, thick and acrid, carrying on the evening wind. As they crested a ridge, the Dawson Ranch came into view, and Ethan's breath caught. The barn was fully engulfed, flames reaching into the darkening sky, sparks swirling like malevolent fireflies. People were running everywhere, fighting the fire, moving livestock away from danger, throwing water on the house to keep it from catching. Thomas immediately took command, organizing the Harrow Ranch men into teams. Some went to reinforce the bucket brigade. Others started cutting fire breaks to prevent the flames from spreading to nearby structures. Ethan found himself in the thick of it, hauling water until his arms screamed, his lungs burning from smoke inhalation, his eyes streaming tears. The battle lasted hours. By the time the fire was finally contained, the barn was a total loss, just smoking timber and ash. But the house was saved, and no one had been seriously injured. Exhausted men collapsed where they stood, blackened with soot and too tired to care. Ethan sat on the ground, his back against a fence post, watching the last of the embers die. Beside him, Samuel coughed and spat black phlegm. "That was close," Samuel said. "Another hour and the whole ranch could have gone up." "Do they have insurance?" Ethan asked. "Out here? No one has insurance. You lose a barn, you rebuild it yourself, or you don't rebuild at all." Thomas appeared out of the smoke and darkness, his face barely recognizable under the soot. "Ethan, Miss Harrow wants to see you." He found Lydia talking with a woman about her own age, Mrs. Dawson, he assumed. Both women looked exhausted, their faces drawn with the strain of near disaster. "This is Ethan Cole," Lydia said to the other woman. "He's training under Thomas. Ethan, this is Martha Dawson." "Ma'am," Ethan said, nodding. Martha Dawson studied him with eyes that had seen too much hardship. "Your people saved our home tonight. We won't forget that." "We take care of our neighbors," Lydia said simply. "That's how survival works out here. Tomorrow we'll send over lumber and men to help rebuild. You'll have a new barn before winter sets in properly." "Lydia, we can't afford—" Martha began. "You'll pay us back when you can," Lydia interrupted. "No interest, no deadline. Just settle the account when your circumstances improve." Martha's eyes filled with tears. "You've already done so much. The water access rates you gave us after we lost the herd, the extension on—" "Martha," Lydia's voice was gentle but firm. "We help each other. That's the agreement my father made with your father-in-law 40 years ago, and it's an agreement I intend to honor. Your ranch survives. Our community stays strong. It's that simple." Watching this exchange, Ethan understood something profound about how Harrow Ranch had endured for so many decades. It wasn't just about having resources. It was about being willing to share them strategically, investing in the community's stability because that stability benefited everyone. The ride back to Harrow Ranch happened in near silence, men too exhausted for conversation. The moon was high by the time they reached home, casting silver light over buildings that represented security and permanence in a landscape where both were rare commodities. Thomas gathered the men before they dispersed to sleep. "You all did good work tonight. The Dawsons won't forget it, and neither will I. Get some rest. We'll be back there at first light to start the rebuild." Ethan stumbled to his room, barely managing to remove his smoke-damaged clothes before collapsing into bed. Sleep came fast and deep, the kind of dreamless oblivion that physical exhaustion brings. The next morning arrived too soon, announced by the bell that called men to breakfast. Ethan's body protested every movement, muscles he didn't know he had, screaming their displeasure. But he dressed and made his way to the cookhouse, where the previous night's firefighters were gathering over strong coffee and hearty food. True to Thomas's word, they rode back to the Dawson Ranch after breakfast, this time accompanied by a wagon loaded with lumber, tools, and supplies. What followed was a week of intensive construction, framing, roofing, fitting doors, and windows. Men from other neighboring ranches showed up to help, creating a kind of informal barn raising that spoke to the interconnected nature of the frontier community. During breaks, Ethan talked with some of these neighbors, learning the complex web of relationships that bound the valley together. Everyone knew everyone else's business, everyone owed someone a favor, and everyone understood that today's helper might be tomorrow's person in need. On the third day of construction, a rider approached carrying official-looking papers. He asked for Miss Harrow, and when she arrived, he handed her an envelope bearing a territorial government seal. Ethan watched from his position on the barn roof as Lydia read the contents, her face darkening with each line. When she finished, she looked up at Thomas with an expression that made Ethan's stomach tighten. "We need to talk," she said. "Privately. Now." Thomas climbed down from the roof and followed her to her horse. They rode a short distance away, conferring in voices too low to hear. But their body language spoke volumes. Thomas's rigid posture, Lydia's sharp gestures, both of them radiating tension. When they returned, Lydia addressed the assembled workers. "Thank you all for your help here. The Dawsons are fortunate to have such good neighbors. Thomas, I need you back at the ranch immediately. Ethan, you're coming too." The ride back was tense. Whatever had been in that letter, it was serious enough to pull them away from the barn raising. As soon as they reached Harrow Ranch, Lydia summoned Thomas and Ethan to her office. "There's a railroad company interested in building a line through this valley," she said without preamble. "They're claiming eminent domain on several parcels of land, including a critical section of our water rights territory." Thomas went pale. "They can't do that. Those rights have been legally established for decades." "They can try," Lydia said grimly. "And they will. The territorial legislature is in the railroad's pocket. They'll approve whatever land seizures the company requests, regardless of prior claims." "How much land?" Ethan asked. 1,200 acres, including the upper sections of Spring Creek. If they take that land, we lose control of the water source. Every agreement we have with ranchers in this valley becomes worthless." The implications crashed over Ethan like a wave. Without the water rights, Harrow Ranch lost its foundation. The entire economic structure that supported not just the ranch but the surrounding community would collapse. "There has to be a way to fight this," Thomas said. "There is," Lydia replied, "but it will require resources, political connections, and legal expertise we don't currently possess. The railroad has money and influence. We have a just claim and the support of the local community. Whether that's enough remains to be seen." She looked at Ethan then, her eyes holding a weight he hadn't seen before. "This is what real power looks like, Mr. Cole. Not the ability to collect debts or extend credit, but the capacity to defend what you've built against forces that want to take it from you. Watch carefully. This is the education you really need." Over the following days, Harrow Ranch transformed from a working operation into something resembling a military headquarters. Lydia brought in lawyers from Denver, compiled decades of documentation establishing the water rights, and began organizing the neighboring ranchers into a coalition to oppose the railroad's land grab. Ethan found himself pulled into meetings that went late into the night, listening as strategies were debated and refined. The railroad company, Rocky Mountain Continental, had proposed a route that would cut directly through the prime grazing land and water sources that made the valley viable for ranching. Their justification was economic development and progress. The reality was that seizing established claims through eminent domain was cheaper than negotiating fair purchase prices. "They're counting on us being too small and too isolated to fight back effectively," one of the lawyers explained. "Rural ranchers without political connections or legal sophistication. They've done this in a dozen other valleys and met minimal resistance." "They haven't met Lydia Harrow before," Thomas muttered. But as the weeks passed, the magnitude of what they were facing became clear. Rocky Mountain Continental had representatives in the territorial capital, had made generous donations to key legislators, and had the full weight of industrial progress on their side. Fighting them would require not just legal arguments, but political maneuvering, public pressure, and resources that even Harrow Ranch would struggle to sustain. Ethan watched Lydia age visibly under the strain. The confusion he'd witnessed that first night seemed to come more frequently now, moments where she'd lose her train of thought mid-sentence or forget conversations from earlier in the day. Thomas covered for her skillfully, but Ethan could see the worry in his eyes. One evening, after a particularly grueling meeting with the lawyers, Ethan found Lydia alone in her office, staring at a map of the ranch with an expression of profound weariness. "Ma'am?" he said softly from the doorway. She looked up, and for a moment didn't seem to recognize him. Then clarity returned. "Ethan, come in." He entered, closing the door behind him. "The lawyers think we have a strong case." "The lawyers are paid to think optimistically," Lydia said. "The reality is that we're fighting people who have more money and more influence than we'll ever possess. If this was just about legal precedent, we'd win easily. But it's about politics and power, and those are games I've never played well." "You're not giving up?" "No," she said firmly. "I'm being realistic. There's a difference. My father spent 30 years building these water rights. I've spent another 50 defending and maintaining them. I won't surrender them without a fight. But I also won't lie to myself about our chances." She stood, moved to the window, her familiar position when discussing difficult truths. When this started, when you first came to this ranch, I thought I had time. Time to teach you everything you'd need to know. Time to transition this operation gradually into capable hands. Time to ensure my father's legacy would survive me. But time, it seems, is the one resource I don't control. We'll win this fight, Ethan said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. Perhaps. Or perhaps Rocky Mountain Continental will seize our water rights, and everything we've built will crumble. Either way, you need to understand what's at stake. This isn't just about one ranch's survival. It's about whether communities like ours can exist at all in the face of industrial expansion, whether established rights mean anything when they conflict with corporate interests, whether the frontier will be shaped by people who live on the land or by investors who view it only as resources to be exploited. She turned to face him, and her expression was fierce despite the exhaustion. That's the real test, Mr. Cole. Not whether you can manage cattle or collect debts or maintain water infrastructure, but whether you can stand against forces that want to erase everything we've built, whether you have the courage and the intelligence and the sheer stubborn determination to protect something worth protecting. Before Ethan could respond, there was a sharp knock on the door. Thomas entered without waiting for permission, his face grim. "Garrett's here," he said. "The man who used to employ Ethan. He's at the front door demanding to see you, making quite a scene." Lydia's eyebrows rose. "How unexpected. Show him in." Ethan's stomach dropped. He hadn't thought about Garrett in months, had almost forgotten his former employer's existence. Now the man was here, and whatever had brought him couldn't be good. Garrett entered the office radiating the same casual cruelty Ethan remembered. He dressed up for the occasion, his best clothes, which still looked shabby compared to Thomas's work attire, but the sneer on his face was pure Garrett. "Miss Harrow," he said, his tone managing to be both obsequious and condescending. "Thank you for seeing me. I've come about a matter of theft." "Theft?" Lydia's voice was cold. "This boy," Garrett pointed at Ethan, "stole from me a horse, supplies, and wages I'd advanced him, took off in the middle of the night and never came back. I want compensation." The lie was so brazen that Ethan almost laughed. "That's not what happened, and you know it." "Quiet," Garrett snapped. "I'm talking to Miss Harrow, not some thieving drifter who—" "Mr. Garrett," Lydia's voice cut through the room like a blade. "You will address Mr. Cole with respect in my home, or you will leave immediately. Do you understand?" Garrett's face reddened, but he nodded. "Now," Lydia continued, "state your complaint clearly and honestly, and be aware that I already know the full circumstances of Mr. Cole's departure from your employment." The confidence drained from Garrett's expression. He had a delivery to make. Never showed up. Cost me a contract with Henderson." "He was helping me," Lydia said flatly. "I was lost in town, and he chose to ensure my safety rather than completing your delivery, for which you fired him, threw out his belongings, and kept wages you owed him. Is that not correct?" He abandoned his duties. He made a choice to help someone in need, and you punished him for showing basic human decency. Now you come to my home, months later, making false accusations of theft in an attempt to extract money you have no right to claim. Did you truly think this would work?" Garrett looked around the room as if searching for allies, finding none. "I just want what I'm owed." "You're owed nothing," Lydia said. "In fact, you owe Mr. Cole for the wages you failed to pay him and for the belongings you disposed of without permission. I could have you arrested for theft far more substantial than anything you're accusing him of." "Now wait just a—" "Thomas," Lydia said calmly, "please escort Mr. Garrett from the property, and make it clear that if he returns or makes any further trouble for Mr. Cole, we will pursue legal remedies. Are we understood?" Thomas moved toward Garrett with the calm efficiency of someone who'd done this before. Garrett backed toward the door, his face mottled with rage and humiliation. "You can't threaten me," he blustered. "I'll go to the sheriff. The sheriff is a personal friend," Lydia interrupted. "As is the territorial judge. Please, by all means, pursue this complaint through official channels. I'm certain they'll be fascinated by your story." Garrett left muttering threats that everyone in the room knew were empty. When the door closed behind him, silence filled the office. "I'm sorry," Ethan said finally. "I never thought he'd come here." "Don't apologize," Lydia said. Men like Garrett are predictable. They hear about your improved circumstances and decide they're owed a piece of it. He won't be back. Bullies never are once they realize their target has protection. But the incident left Ethan shaken. It was a reminder of how precarious his old life had been, how easily he could have remained trapped in that cycle of poverty and exploitation. The distance between that life and his current position felt both enormous and frighteningly small. That night, lying in his room, Ethan thought about everything that had happened since he'd stopped on that trading post porch. He'd gained a future, learned skills he'd never imagined possessing, and become part of something larger than mere survival. But he'd also learned that security was an illusion, that everything built over generations could be threatened by forces far beyond individual control. The railroad wanted their land. Garrett wanted revenge or money or both. And somewhere in the background, time itself was eroding Lydia's formidable mind, stealing the woman who'd built this ranch into an empire one memory at a time. Ethan fell asleep thinking about tests and choices and the cruel irony that sometimes doing the right thing led not to reward, but to battles you never asked to fight. The battle with Rocky Mountain Continental consumed the next 3 months like a slow-burning fire. Legal briefs were filed and countered, depositions were taken, and the lawyers Lydia had hired worked around the clock, building a case that hinged on decades of established precedent and territorial law. But beneath the legal maneuvering, everyone involved understood the real fight was happening in smoke-filled rooms in the territorial capital, where railroad money talked louder than frontier justice. Winter settled over the valley with unusual severity, snow piling in drifts that reached the second-story windows of the ranch buildings. The work continued regardless. Livestock needed tending, fences needed mending, and the daily operations of a ranch this size didn't pause for legal battles or inclement weather. Ethan threw himself into the work with an intensity that bordered on desperation, as if staying busy could somehow influence outcomes he had no power to control. He was mucking out stalls one bitter January morning when Thomas found him, his expression unreadable in the dim barn light. "Leave that," Thomas said. "Miss Harrow wants to see you. Now." The walk to the main house felt like walking to judgment. Ethan's mind raced through possibilities, none of them good. Had the railroad won? Had the lawyers discovered some fatal weakness in their case? Had something happened to Lydia herself? He found her in her office, but she wasn't alone. A well-dressed man in his 60s sat across from her desk, examining papers with the kind of careful attention that marked him as either a lawyer or an accountant. When Ethan entered, both of them looked up. "Ethan," Lydia said, and her voice carried a weariness that seemed to reach her bones. "This is Mr. Franklin Pierce, my attorney from Denver. We need to discuss your future." The words hit like a physical blow. Your future, not the future. Something fundamental had shifted. "Please sit," Pierce said, gesturing to an empty chair. His tone was kind but professional, the voice of someone accustomed to delivering difficult news. Ethan sat, his hands gripping the armrest to keep them from shaking. "I'll be direct," Lydia said. "The legal battle with Rocky Mountain Continental is going worse than we anticipated. They've secured preliminary approval from the territorial legislature for their land seizure. Our appeals are still pending, but the outcome looks increasingly grim." "How long?" Ethan asked. "The final ruling should come by early spring. If we lose, when we lose, the ranch will lose control of the water rights that make it viable. Without those rights, we can't honor our agreements with neighboring ranchers. The entire economic foundation collapses." Pierce cleared his throat. "Miss Harrow has asked me to help prepare for that eventuality, to ensure that when the collapse comes, it's as controlled as possible, that employees are taken care of, debts are settled properly, and the land itself is protected as much as circumstances allow." "You're giving up," Ethan said, unable to keep the accusation from his voice. "I'm being realistic," Lydia replied, echoing words she'd spoken months earlier. "I've spent 3 months and more money than I care to calculate fighting this battle. The railroad has unlimited resources and the full backing of territorial power. We can delay the inevitable, but we can't prevent it. So what happens to everyone here? To Thomas? To Samuel? To all the men who depend on this ranch?" "That's why you're here," Pierce said. "Miss Harrow has instructed me to create severance packages for all employees, enough to help them relocate and establish themselves elsewhere. It won't replace what they're losing, but it's something." Ethan looked at Lydia, seeing the defeat in her eyes and hating it. Your father spent 30 years building this. You've spent 50 years defending it, and you're just going to let them take it? My father, Lydia said softly, built this ranch in a different time, a time when the frontier still belonged to individuals willing to work hard and play fair. That time is ending, Ethan. The future belongs to corporations and railroads and men who measure value only in profit margins. I can rage against that reality, or I can accept it and try to minimize the damage. No. Ethan stood, surprising himself with the vehemence in his voice. That's not the woman who tested an entire town to find one person with character. That's not the woman who extended credit to the Dawsons when their barn burned. That's not the woman who taught me that power means nothing if you don't use it to protect what matters. Sit down, Mr. Cole, Pierce said firmly. But Lydia raised a hand, silencing the lawyer. Let him speak. Well, you brought me here because I made a choice nobody else would make, Ethan said, the words tumbling out faster than he could organize them. You tested me, and I passed, and you said that kind of character was rare. Well, it works both ways. You don't get to teach me that some things are worth fighting for and then surrender the moment the fight gets hard. This isn't about courage, Lydia said. It's about accepting reality. Then the reality is wrong and needs to be changed, Ethan shot back. You have resources they can't match. You have the support of every rancher in this valley. You have decades of legal precedent. You have relationships with people who remember what your father built and why it mattered. Use it. All of it. Stop fighting like you're alone. Silence filled the office. Pierce looked uncomfortable, clearly unused to watching employees challenge their employers so directly. But Lydia's expression had changed, the defeat replaced by something that looked almost like hope. Go on, she said quietly. Ethan took a breath, his mind racing. The railroad's strength is money and political influence, but their weakness is public perception. They're an outside force trying to seize established land rights from frontier families. That's a story people understand, a story that makes them angry. We need to make this fight visible, make it impossible for politicians to side with the railroad without facing consequences. We've tried that, Pierce interjected. The newspapers in the capital are owned by railroad interests. They're not going to... Then we go around them, Ethan interrupted. There are newspapers in other territories, papers that love stories about corporate greed and frontier justice. We bring reporters here, show them what the railroad is trying to destroy, introduce them to the Dawsons and the Hendersons and all the other families who'll lose everything if this land grab succeeds. We make this a national story, not just a local dispute. Lydia leaned forward, her eyes sharp with the intelligence that occasionally still cut through the fog. That's a gamble. If we lose anyway, we'll have spent resources we could have used to protect our employees. And if we don't try, Ethan countered, we guarantee the loss. At least this way we go down fighting, and maybe, just maybe, we change the outcome. Pierce looked at Lydia. Miss Harrow, this is highly irregular. The boy has no experience with... The boy, Lydia said, cutting him off, just articulated a strategy that my expensive lawyers failed to consider. Perhaps inexperience is exactly what this situation needs. She stood, moving to her familiar spot by the window. All right, Mr. Cole, you want to fight? Then fight. But understand that you're gambling with more than just this ranch. You're gambling with the livelihoods of 38 families, with relationships built over decades, with my father's entire legacy. If your strategy fails, the consequences fall on all of us. I understand, Ethan said, though his stomach was churning with the weight of what he'd just committed to. Then get Thomas in here, Lydia ordered. If we're going to do this, we need to move fast. The final ruling could come any day. The next week passed in a blur of activity. Thomas took charge of contacting sympathetic journalists, leveraging relationships with former ranch hands who'd moved to cities and newspapers across the Western territories. Ethan worked with the neighboring ranchers, organizing a coalition that could speak with one voice about what the railroad's land seizure would mean for the entire valley. The response was better than anyone had hoped. A reporter from the San Francisco Chronicle arrived first, a sharp-eyed woman named Margaret Walsh, who'd built a career exposing corporate malfeasance. She spent 3 days interviewing everyone from Lydia down to the newest ranch hand, taking notes and photographs that would form the backbone of her story. This is exactly what my readers need to see, Walsh said as she prepared to leave. Eastern money destroying Western communities, progress that benefits investors while impoverishing the people who actually live on the land. The Chronicle will run this on the front page. More journalists followed, from Denver, from Salt Lake City, from as far away as Chicago. Each one arrived skeptical and left convinced, their notebooks filled with stories of families who'd prospered through fair dealing and community support. All of it threatened by a railroad company that saw the land only as an obstacle to profit. The stories began appearing in late February, each one adding pressure to the territorial politicians who'd been quietly supporting Rocky Mountain Continental's land grab. Letters flooded the governor's office. Editorials questioned the wisdom of empowering corporations over established landowners, and suddenly what had seemed like a foregone conclusion became politically complicated. But the railroad wasn't passive. They hired their own journalists to write counter-stories about progress and economic development, about frontier landowners standing in the way of civilization's advance. Money flowed to key legislators, reminding them where their real loyalties should lie. The battle that had started in courtrooms expanded into newspapers and public opinion, becoming something larger and more unpredictable than anyone had anticipated. Through it all, Ethan watched Lydia carefully. The stress was taking its toll. Her moments of confusion came more frequently, sometimes mid-conversation, sometimes in the middle of important meetings. Thomas covered for her skillfully, but Ethan could see the strain it caused both of them. One evening in early March, Ethan found Lydia in her office staring at papers she didn't seem to recognize. When he entered, she looked up with confusion that slowly cleared into recognition. "Ethan," she said, "What day is it?" "Thursday, March 7th. "Thursday." She repeated the word as if testing its validity. "I had a meeting with someone about something important." "The lawyers," Ethan prompted gently. "They were supposed to brief you on the latest court filings." "Of course. The lawyers." She set down the papers, and when she looked at him again, her eyes held a clarity that seemed to cost her something to maintain. "I'm losing it, aren't I? Not just the ranch. My mind. It comes and goes, and each time it goes, it takes a little more with it." Ethan wanted to deny it, to offer false comfort, but he'd learned that Lydia valued honesty above kindness. "Yes, ma'am. It's getting worse." "Good. I need you to be honest with me, especially now." She stood, though the movement seemed to require more effort than it should. "How long do you think I have? Before I can't function at all?" "I don't know. I'm not a doctor. But you're observant, and you've been watching me closely. Guess." Ethan thought about the patterns he'd noticed, the increasing frequency of confused episodes, the longer time it took for clarity to return. 6 months, maybe less. Lydia nodded as if he'd confirmed something she already knew. "Then we need to accelerate everything. The legal battle, the succession planning, all of it. I won't leave this ranch's future uncertain because I waited too long to face uncomfortable truths." "Miss Harrow, listen to me carefully," she interrupted, her voice taking on the commanding tone he remembered from their first real conversation. "When I'm gone, whether that's from this illness or from simple old age, this ranch needs leadership that understands what my father built and why it matters. Thomas is capable, but he's also 68 years old. He can maintain what exists, but he can't adapt it to whatever comes next." "You're talking about succession again." "I'm talking about survival. This ranch needs someone young enough to fight the battles ahead, smart enough to adapt to changing circumstances, and principled enough to honor the foundations we've laid. Someone willing to make hard choices and unpopular decisions. Someone who'll stop to help a confused old woman even when it costs them everything." The implication of her words settled over Ethan like a weight. "I'm not ready for that kind of responsibility." "No one ever is. My father wasn't ready when he bought the first acre. I wasn't ready when my brothers wanted to sell, and I had to buy them out. You're never ready for the moments that define your life. You just face them and do your best." Before Ethan could respond, rapid footsteps echoed in the hallway. Thomas burst into the office, his face flushed with exertion and something that looked like cautious hope. "The ruling came down," he said, breathing hard. The territorial court rejected Rocky Mountain Continental's eminent domain claim. The water rights stay with us. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Lydia sat down heavily in her chair, and Ethan saw her hands trembling. "On what grounds?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Public interest." The judge ruled that established water rights serving multiple ranching families outweighed the railroad's development claims. He cited the newspaper coverage, the community coalition, the economic impact analysis we provided, said that territorial development can't come at the cost of destroying functional communities. "Did they indicate whether the railroad will appeal?" Pierce's voice came from the doorway, where he'd appeared behind Thomas. "They can appeal," Thomas said, but the judge's ruling was comprehensive. He addressed every argument they made and found them all wanting. An appeal would be expensive and time-consuming with uncertain prospects of success. Lydia looked at Ethan, and something passed between them, an acknowledgement of what his gamble had cost and what it had won. "We did it," she said. "Against every reasonable expectation, we actually did it." "You did it," Ethan corrected. "I just pushed you to keep fighting." "Sometimes that's what leadership is," Lydia replied, seeing clearly when everyone else is ready to surrender. The celebration that followed was subdued but genuine. Word spread quickly through the ranch and then throughout the valley. Neighbors who'd been preparing to lose everything suddenly had futures again. The coalition of ranchers that had formed to fight the railroad transformed into something more permanent, a formal association dedicated to protecting their collective interests against future threats. But amid the relief and celebration, Ethan noticed something troubling. Lydia participated in the festivities with apparent pleasure, accepting congratulations and making appropriate responses. But her eyes held a distance, a disconnection that suggested she wasn't fully present. Several times, Thomas had to quietly remind her of names or redirect conversations that were wandering into confusion. The toll of the 3-month battle had accelerated her decline. The victory had come, but at a cost measured in cognitive function that couldn't be recovered. 3 days after the ruling, Lydia summoned Ethan to her office again. This time Pierce was there with a stack of legal documents that looked ominous in their precision. "Sit down, Mr. Cole," Pierce said, his tone formal. "We have matters to discuss." Ethan sat, his stomach knotting with apprehension. "The battle with Rocky Mountain Continental is over," Lydia began, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "We won, which means this ranch will continue. But victory doesn't change the other reality we're facing. My health is declining rapidly. I need to ensure proper succession before I'm no longer capable of making sound decisions." "We've discussed this with Thomas," Pierce added. "He's agreed that the ranch needs younger leadership going forward. He'll remain as senior advisor, but operational control needs to transfer to someone who can guide this place into the future." Ethan's mouth went dry. "You're offering me control of the ranch?" "Not immediately," Lydia clarified. "You're still learning, still proving yourself. But within the next year, assuming you continue to demonstrate the judgment and character you've shown thus far, yes, full operational control with Thomas as advisor and mentor." "I'm 20 years old," Ethan protested. "There are men here who've worked this ranch for decades. They'll never accept taking orders from someone my age." "They'll accept it because I'm ordering them to," Lydia said flatly, "and because you've earned it. You saw a strategy when my expensive lawyers saw only defeat. You organized a coalition that saved not just this ranch, but every operation in this valley. That's leadership, Mr. Cole, regardless of your age." Pierce slid a document across the desk. "This is a contract outlining the terms of succession. Read it carefully. You'll have operational control, but not ownership. That will remain in trust until certain conditions are met. Miss Harrow will retain final authority on major decisions as long as she's capable of making them. When she's no longer able to function in that capacity, full control transfers to you with certain checks and balances to protect against abuse." Ethan stared at the document without touching it, feeling like he was looking at his entire future compressed into legal language. "What happens if I fail? If I make bad decisions or can't handle the responsibility?" "Then the trust has provisions for removing you and finding alternative management," Pierce said. "But Miss Harrow believes you won't fail, and frankly, after watching you navigate the railroad situation, I'm inclined to agree with her assessment." "There's one more thing," Lydia said, and her voice carried a weight that made Ethan look up from the contract. The success we achieved against Rocky Mountain Continental came from understanding that this ranch doesn't exist in isolation. It survives because the community around it survives, because we've built relationships based on fair dealing and mutual support. That has to continue, Ethan. No matter how much pressure you face to maximize profits or take advantage of our position, the principles my father established have to remain inviolate. Can you commit to that? Ethan thought about everything he'd learned over the past months, about Henderson's debt and the Dawson's fire and the water agreements that kept dozens of families viable, about the difference between having power and using it responsibly, about the kind of man he wanted to become versus the kind survival alone might force him to be. I can commit to that, he said. I will commit to that. Then sign the contract, Lydia said, and accept the burden that comes with it. Ethan picked up the pen Pierce offered, his hand steadier than he felt. The signature he placed at the bottom of the document felt like crossing a threshold, from the broke ranch hand who'd stopped on a trading post porch to something else entirely, something he still didn't fully understand. Congratulations, Mr. Cole, Pierce said, gathering the signed documents. You're now the operational director of Harrow Ranch, pending the transition period. I'll file these with the Territorial Recorder's Office tomorrow. After Pierce left, Ethan sat alone with Lydia in her office. The afternoon light was fading, casting long shadows across the room that had witnessed so many significant conversations. Do you remember that first night? Lydia asked. When you brought me home and I told you about my father's vision for this place? I remember. I wasn't entirely truthful with you then. I said I'd been testing the town, watching to see who would stop. That was true. But I was also testing myself, testing whether I could still recognize character when I saw it. Whether the fog that's been stealing my thoughts had left me capable of making one final good decision. You made the right decision, Ethan said. We'll see, Lydia replied. The real test isn't whether you can handle success. It's whether you can handle failure, whether you can make hard choices when they cost you something personal, whether you can stay true to principles when betraying them would be easier and more profitable. Those tests are still ahead of you. I know. Good. Self-awareness is the beginning of wisdom. She stood, moving once more to her window, looking out over the empire her father had built and she had defended. My father used to say that the measure of a person's character is what they do when no one's watching, but I think there's more to it than that. True character is what you do when everyone's watching, when the pressure to compromise is overwhelming, when staying true to your principles means sacrificing immediate gain for uncertain future benefit. That sounds harder, Ethan admitted. It is harder, which is why so few people manage it. She turned to face him, and despite the fog that increasingly clouded her thoughts, her eyes held absolute clarity in that moment. I'm trusting you with more than a ranch, Ethan. I'm trusting you with a legacy, with a vision of how business can be conducted ethically, with the futures of families who depend on this place continuing to honor the agreements we've made. Don't make me regret this. I won't, Ethan said, the words feeling like both a promise and a prayer. Then go. You have work to do, and I need rest. This victory took more out of me than I care to admit. Ethan left her there, standing by her window in the fading light, a woman who'd spent her entire life defending something worth defending and was now entrusting it to a boy she'd met on a trading post porch less than a year ago. The enormity of what he'd accepted settled over him as he walked back to his quarters. He'd gone from homeless to propertyless, from having nothing to being responsible for everything, from survival mode to steward of an empire. The weight should have crushed him. Instead, it felt like purpose. The first real purpose he'd known since his parents died and left him adrift in a world that didn't care whether he lived or failed. That night, lying in his room, Ethan thought about the cruel irony of it all. He'd sacrificed everything to help a stranger and had been rewarded with opportunity beyond anything he could have imagined. But that reward came wrapped in responsibility that could destroy him if he failed, came attached to an aging woman whose mind was betraying her, came with the understanding that 38 families and countless others would rise or fall based on decisions he hadn't yet learned how to make properly. He'd stopped on that porch because walking past felt wrong. That single choice had led him here, to this room, this ranch, this impossible future. And somehow, despite the fear and the doubt and the crushing weight of expectation, it still felt like the right choice. Outside, snow began falling again, blanketing the valley in white silence. Somewhere in the main house, Lydia Harrow was probably sleeping, her formidable mind taking its rest while it still could. Somewhere in the bunkhouse, Thomas was likely awake, worrying about whether this gamble on youth would pay off or destroy everything he'd spent decades helping to build. And here in his small room, Ethan Cole lay awake staring at the ceiling, terrified and determined in equal measure, understanding finally what Lydia had meant about tests. The real test wasn't what he'd already done. It was what came next. Whether he could become the person this responsibility demanded, whether character forged in poverty could sustain itself in power, whether the boy who'd stopped for a stranger could grow into the man who'd protect thousands. The answer to those questions lay ahead, waiting to be written in the daily choices and hard decisions that leadership demanded. For now, all Ethan could do was accept the burden he'd been given and hope that the character Lydia had seen in him would prove sufficient for the challenges ahead. Spring arrived with a violence that seemed to mirror the changes sweeping through Harrow Ranch. Snow melted in torrents, flooding creeks and turning the valley roads into rivers of mud. The land itself seemed to be in transition, shedding winter's death to make room for whatever would grow in the season ahead. Ethan's transition into leadership proved equally turbulent. The contract had been signed, the documents filed, but authority on paper meant nothing to men who'd been working this ranch since before he was born. He faced silent resistance at first, orders acknowledged but executed slowly, suggestions met with tight-lipped nods that communicated skepticism more clearly than words ever could. Thomas helped where he could, lending his credibility to Ethan's decisions. But even Thomas couldn't change the fundamental reality that Ethan was young, relatively inexperienced, and hadn't earned his position through years of proven competence. He'd earned it through a single act of kindness and Lydia's faith in his character. That foundation, however solid in principle, felt fragile under the weight of daily operations. The first real test came in April, when the spring floods threatened to wash out the lower bridges that connected the ranch to the valley roads. Ethan stood with Thomas and a crew of ranch hands, watching water surge past at levels none of them had seen in years. "We need to reinforce the supports," Ethan said, his voice carrying over the roar of the current. "If those bridges go, we're isolated until the water recedes." "Reinforcing them now is suicide," said Marcus Webb, a weathered ranch hand who'd been with Harrow Ranch for 23 years. "That current would sweep a man away before he got halfway across. We should wait it out, rebuild after if necessary. If we wait and the bridges wash out, we'll have no way to transport livestock to market, no way to get supplies in, no connection to the rest of the valley for weeks," Ethan countered. "We can't afford that kind of isolation." "Can't afford losing men either," Marcus shot back. "Water's too dangerous right now." The crew watched this exchange with careful attention, waiting to see how their young director would handle being challenged by someone with far more experience. Ethan met Marcus's eyes, understanding that this moment was about more than bridges and flood management. "You're right that the current's dangerous. So we don't send men into the water. We rig cable systems from the banks, use counterweights to position the support timbers, work from above rather than below. It'll take longer, but it can be done safely." "That's theory," Marcus said. "Theory don't always work in practice." "Then we test it first," Ethan replied. "Small scale. Prove the concept works before we commit to the full reinforcement. If it doesn't work, we abandon it and do things your way. But we have to try." Thomas had been watching this exchange in silence. Now he spoke. "The cable system could work. We used something similar during the flood of '68 before you came on, Marcus. Different situation, but the principle's sound." Marcus looked between Thomas and Ethan, his expression showing the internal calculation of a man deciding whether to accept or continue fighting. Finally, he nodded. "All right, we try it your way. But first sign it's not working, we pull back. Agreed?" "Agreed," Ethan said. The system worked, but just barely. It took 2 full days of exhausting labor, rigging cables and positioning timbers while the flood raged inches from where they stood. There were moments when Ethan questioned his own judgment, when it seemed Marcus had been right to counsel waiting. But the bridges held, the supports were reinforced, and when the flood finally receded a week later, Harrow Ranch remained connected to the valley while other operations struggled with washed-out infrastructure. Marcus never said the words directly, but his attitude shifted after that. The silent resistance became grudging cooperation, and gradually something that approached respect. The other ranch hands followed his lead, and Ethan found his orders being executed with more promptness and less obvious skepticism. But the victory was bittersweet. Throughout the crisis, Lydia had remained in the main house, largely unaware of the drama unfolding. Her lucid moments were becoming rarer, separated by increasing stretches of confusion that sometimes lasted days. Thomas reported that she'd started forgetting basic things: where she was, what year it was, sometimes even who people were. One evening in late April, Ethan was reviewing water rights contracts in what had become his office, a small room off the main barn that Thomas had helped him establish, when a ranch hand found him. "Miss Harrow's asking for you," the man said. "Says it's important." Ethan found her in her office, looking frail in a way that struck him like a physical blow. She'd lost weight, her frame seeming to shrink into her clothes, and her eyes held a feverish quality that suggested she was burning through her remaining energy to maintain clarity. "Sit down, Ethan," she said, her voice steady despite her appearance. "We need to talk while I still can." "Miss Harrow, you should rest." "I'll have eternity to rest," she interrupted. "Right now, I need you to listen carefully because I don't know how much longer I'll be able to have this conversation." Ethan sat, his throat tight with emotions he couldn't name. "The ranch is in good hands," Lydia began. "You've proven that over the past months. Thomas tells me about the bridges, about how you're handling the men, about the decisions you're making. You're learning faster than I dared hope. I'm trying to honor what you've taught me. I know, and you're succeeding. But there's one more thing I need you to understand, one final lesson that will determine whether this ranch survives long term." She paused, gathering her thoughts with visible effort. "Power and wealth don't just corrupt through greed, they corrupt through isolation. The more you have, the easier it becomes to forget what it feels like to have nothing, to need help, to depend on the kindness of strangers." "I won't forget," Ethan said. "You say that now, but time has a way of eroding even the strongest memories. 10 years from now, 20, you'll be tempted to see the ranch as separate from the community, to prioritize profit over principles, to forget that your success depends on the valley's health, not just your own bottom line." She leaned forward, her eyes burning with intensity. "When that temptation comes, and it will come, I need you to remember something specific." "What?" "Remember what it felt like to be broke and desperate and fired, to have 73 cents to your name and nowhere to go. Remember standing at that trading post with a deadline looming, knowing that stopping to help would cost you everything. Remember making that choice anyway." Her voice caught, and for a moment the clarity wavered. Then it steadied. "That boy who stopped that night, he understood something essential about what it means to be human. Don't let success make you forget him." "I won't," Ethan promised, the words feeling inadequate for what she was asking. "There's more," Lydia continued. "In my desk, locked drawer on the right, there's an envelope with your name on it. Don't open it now. Open it on the 10th anniversary of the day you came to this ranch. Inside, you'll find instructions for a program I want you to implement, a way to pass forward what was given to you. Promise me you'll read it and consider it carefully." "I promise." "Good." She settled back in her chair, and Ethan could see exhaustion claiming her. "Now leave me. I'm tired and you have work to do. The ranch won't run itself just because its owner is falling apart." Ethan stood, but hesitated at the door. "Miss Harrow, thank you for everything, for seeing something in me worth saving, for giving me a future when I had none." Lydia's smile was sad but genuine. "You gave yourself a future, Ethan, the moment you chose to stop. I just recognized what was already there." 3 weeks later, Lydia Harrow suffered a stroke that left her unable to speak or recognize anyone around her. She lingered for 2 more days in a state somewhere between sleep and consciousness, her formidable mind finally surrendering to the illness that had been claiming it piece by piece for years. She died on a Tuesday morning in early May, with Thomas and Ethan at her bedside. Her last expression, Ethan thought, looked peaceful, like someone who'd carried a heavy burden for decades and was finally allowed to set it down. The funeral drew people from across the territory: ranchers and railroad executives, territorial officials, and simple farmers, all coming to pay respects to a woman who'd shaped the valley through 5 decades of principled leadership. Ethan stood beside Thomas, shaking hands and accepting condolences from people he'd never met, all of them sharing stories about Lydia's fairness, her integrity, her unwavering commitment to honoring agreements even when breaking them would have been more profitable. She was the last of her kind, one elderly rancher said, his voice thick with grief. They don't make them like that anymore. All these young people coming up, they only care about money and progress. They don't understand about legacy and community. The words stung because Ethan knew they were partly directed at him, the young upstart who'd inherited an empire through luck rather than earning it through decades of hard work. But he accepted the criticism in silence, understanding that he'd have to prove himself through actions rather than defending himself with words. After the funeral, as the crowd dispersed and the sun set over the valley, Thomas found Ethan standing alone by Lydia's grave. "She believed in you," Thomas said quietly. "More than she believed in anyone else I ever saw her consider for succession. That should count for something." "It counts for everything," Ethan replied, "which is why the weight of it feels so heavy." "Good. The day it stops feeling heavy is the day you've lost what made her choose you in the first place." Thomas was quiet for a moment, then continued. "She left me a letter. Instructions for helping you transition into full control. Advice on situations she anticipated you might face. Did she leave you anything?" "An envelope I'm not supposed to open for 10 years. Thomas nodded as if this made perfect sense. "That sounds like Lydia. Always thinking ahead, always planning for contingencies. You'll understand why when the time comes." They stood together in the fading light, two men bound by grief and responsibility, and the shared burden of honoring a legacy neither of them fully understood yet, but both were committed to protecting. The years that followed tested Ethan in ways Lydia's training couldn't fully have prepared him for. He made mistakes, some small, some significant enough to cost the ranch money and credibility. But he learned from each one, adapting and adjusting, gradually growing into the role that had been thrust upon him. The water rights remained secure, defended successfully against 2 more attempts by outside interests to seize them through legal maneuvering. The ranch prospered, expanding carefully into new ventures while maintaining the core principles Lydia's father had established. Ethan honored the agreements with neighboring ranchers, extended credit when circumstances warranted it, and slowly built his own reputation as someone who dealt fairly even when being ruthless would have been more profitable. Thomas remained as advisor and mentor until his own health began failing in the ranch's 8th year under Ethan's leadership. On his deathbed, Thomas gripped Ethan's hand with surprising strength. "You've exceeded every expectation," Thomas said. "Lydia would be proud. I know I am." "I couldn't have done any of this without you," Ethan replied, his voice rough with emotion. "That's what makes you a good leader," Thomas said. "Knowing you can't do it alone, being willing to listen and learn. Too many men in your position think they have all the answers. You never stopped asking questions." Thomas died that night, and Ethan buried him next to Lydia on a hillside overlooking the ranch they'd both dedicated their lives to building and protecting. The 10th anniversary of Ethan's arrival at Harrow Ranch came on a cold February evening. He was 30 years old now, no longer the desperate boy who'd stopped at a trading post porch, but a man who'd earned his position through a decade of hard decisions and harder work. The ranch employed 52 people now, had expanded into timber operations in the higher elevations, and had become the economic anchor for a valley that had grown alongside it. Ethan sat alone in what had been Lydia's office and was now his, the locked drawer of her desk open in front of him. He'd thought about this envelope countless times over the years, wondered what instructions or wisdom she'd left for him to discover a decade later. The paper was yellowed with age, the ink slightly faded, but Lydia's handwriting remained clear and precise. "Dear Ethan," it began, "if you're reading this, 10 years have passed since you came to this ranch. You've either succeeded in honoring what my father built, or you've failed and are looking for guidance I can no longer provide in person. Either way, these words are for you. I told you once that the measure of character is what you do when doing right costs you something. You proved that measure on a trading post porch, and I believe you've continued proving it in the years since. But now comes the harder test, what you do with the power and wealth you've accumulated. You have resources now that the boy who stopped that night could barely imagine. The question is whether you'll use those resources to insulate yourself from the world's suffering, or whether you'll use them to create the kind of opportunity that was given to you. Here's what I want you to do. Create a program, call it whatever you like, that identifies young people in circumstances similar to yours at 19. Broke, desperate, but possessing character and potential that poverty has kept from flourishing. Give them what I gave you: real work, real training, real opportunity to build futures they couldn't access otherwise. Don't make it charity. Make them earn it the way you earned it. Test their character, their integrity, their willingness to sacrifice immediate comfort for long-term purpose. The ones who pass those tests, give them the same chance I gave you. This ranch has always survived by thinking beyond profit margins, by investing in people and community. Continue that tradition. Expand it. Make it the foundation of how Harrow Ranch operates going forward. If you do this, if you pass forward what was given to you, then my father's vision will outlive both of us. It will become something larger than any individual owner or manager. It will become a legacy measured in changed lives and opportunity created. That's the final test, Ethan. Not whether you can manage this ranch successfully, but whether you can transform it into something that creates more people like yourself. People who understand that power means nothing if it's not used to lift others up. I believe you can do this. I believed it the night you brought me home, and I believe it now, even though I'm not there to see it. Don't disappoint me. With faith and hope, Lydia Harrow. Ethan set down the letter, his vision blurred with tears he didn't try to hide. The weight of what she was asking felt enormous. To take the miracle that had saved him and systematize it. To make opportunity creation part of the ranch's core mission, rather than just a lucky accident that had changed one boy's life. But beneath the weight, he felt something else: rightness. This was why she'd chosen him, why she'd invested so much time and energy into his training. Not just to preserve what existed, but to expand it, to make Harrow Ranch an engine of transformation rather than just a successful business operation. He spent the next 6 months designing the program, working with lawyers and advisors to create something sustainable and effective. The Harrow Fellowship, they called it. A structured apprenticeship that would take 6 young people each year, individuals aged 18 to 25, who demonstrated character and potential but lacked opportunity due to circumstances beyond their control. The program launched in its first year with 7 fellows instead of 6. Ethan had found it impossible to choose between the final 2 applicants and decided to fund an extra position out of his own salary. They came from across the territory. A young woman who'd been supporting her siblings after their parents died, a freed slave from the South trying to build a new life in the West, an Irish immigrant who'd lost everything in a factory fire, and 4 others with equally compelling stories of hardship met with determination. Ethan worked with each of them personally, teaching what Thomas and Lydia had taught him, not just practical skills, but the principles underlying every decision. Fair dealing, long-term thinking, community investment, the difference between having power and using it responsibly. Some of the fellows thrived immediately. Others struggled and eventually left, unable to adapt to the demands or unwilling to embrace the philosophy underlying the program. But enough succeeded that by the program's 5th year, 3 of the original 7 fellows had established their own operations in the valley, built on the same principles they'd learned at Harrow Ranch. The program expanded. By the time Ethan was 40, the Harrow Fellowship had trained 63 young people, and 41 of them had gone on to establish successful operations or take leadership positions in existing businesses. The valley's economy diversified and strengthened, built on a network of people who understood that individual success depended on community health. The transformation wasn't always smooth. There were failures and setbacks, fellows who disappointed, and opportunities that didn't work out. But the overall trajectory was undeniable. Harrow Ranch had become more than a successful business operation. It had become a force for systematic opportunity creation, a living embodiment of Lydia's vision of what ethical capitalism could achieve. As the years passed, Ethan occasionally thought about that February evening in Redstone Hollow, about the choice he'd made on a trading post porch. Sometimes, usually late at night when exhaustion made his defenses weak, he wondered who he would have become if he'd ridden past Lydia that night, delivered his supplies on time, kept his miserable job with Garrett. The answer was obvious and depressing. He'd have remained trapped in poverty, moving from one exploitative employer to another, grinding himself down until he was too broken to care anymore. He'd have become one of the bitter men who populated frontier towns, trading hope for survival and calling it wisdom. Instead, he'd stopped. And that single choice had cascaded into a life he couldn't have imagined that desperate night. A life of purpose and impact, of meaningful work and genuine contribution to something larger than himself. On a spring morning, 30 years after he'd first arrived at Harrow Ranch, Ethan stood on the same hillside where Lydia and Thomas were buried, looking out over the valley that had been transformed by their vision and his execution of it. He was 49 years old now, his hair going gray, his body bearing the accumulated wear of 3 decades of hard work. But his eyes remained clear, and his sense of purpose remained strong. A young woman approached from behind, Maria Cortez, one of the current Harrow Fellows, who'd been working the ranch for 8 months. She stopped beside him, following his gaze across the valley. "It's beautiful up here," she said. "I can see why you come here when you need to think." "Lydia and Thomas are buried here," Ethan said, gesturing toward the modest headstones. This seemed like the right place for them, overlooking everything they built, everything they protected. Maria was quiet for a moment. "Can I ask you something about the night you met Miss Harrow?" Ethan smiled. The story had become something of a legend among the fellows, embellished over time, but retaining its essential truth. "What do you want to know?" "When you stopped that night, when you made the choice to help her even though it cost you everything, did you know it would lead to all this? Did you have any idea?" "None whatsoever," Ethan said. "I just knew that walking past felt wrong. That's all. The rest happened because Lydia saw something in that choice, something worth cultivating." "And now you do the same thing," Maria observed, "looking for people who make choices that cost them something, who show character when it's not convenient." "That's what the program is about," Ethan confirmed. "Identifying people who already have what matters: integrity, determination, willingness to sacrifice for principles, and giving them the resources and training to build lives that honor those qualities." Maria nodded slowly. "I want you to know that it's working. What you're doing here, what Miss Harrow started, it's changing lives. Not just the fellows, but everyone around us. The whole valley is different because of this program." "That was always the goal," Ethan said. "To create something that outlasts any individual, something that keeps generating opportunity and principled leadership long after everyone currently involved is gone." They stood together in companionable silence, watching the ranch operations continue below them. People working, livestock moving, the daily rhythms of a thriving enterprise built on foundations laid more than 80 years ago by a man who'd understood that real wealth wasn't measured in acres or dollars, but in sustainable communities and ethical relationships. Eventually, Maria spoke again. "There's a situation developing in town. The old trading post building, the one where you met Miss Harrow, it's being torn down to make room for a new bank. Some people think we should try to preserve it, given its significance to the ranch's history." Ethan considered this. The trading post had been abandoned for years, its sagging porch and peeling paint a testament to Redstone Hollow's slow decline as the economic center of the valley had shifted elsewhere. Preserving it would require significant resources with no practical return. But practicality wasn't the only measure of value. "Buy the building," Ethan said. "Restore it properly. Then convert it into a community center, somewhere people can gather, where we can hold meetings, where new fellows can learn the ranch's history and understand the foundations we're building on. Make it a living reminder of how one choice in the right moment can change everything." Maria smiled. "I'll start the paperwork tomorrow." As she walked back down the hill toward the main ranch buildings, Ethan remained standing beside the graves of the people who'd shaped his life so profoundly. The sun was warm on his face, and the valley spread below him looked peaceful and prosperous, a testament to decades of principled decisions and community investment. He thought about Lydia's letter, about her challenge to pass forward what had been given to him. He'd done that, had built a systematic program that created opportunities for dozens of young people facing the same kind of desperation he'd known at 19. But the work wasn't finished. It would never be finished, because each generation would bring new challenges, new people in need of opportunity, new tests of whether character and principles could survive in a world that constantly pressured people to compromise both. That evening, Ethan met with the current cohort of Harrow Fellows in what had become a weekly tradition, a dinner where they discussed not just the practical aspects of ranch management, but the philosophical foundations underlying every decision. Tonight's topic was water rights and community responsibility, using the original agreements Lydia's father had established as case studies in long-term thinking. The question you always have to ask, Ethan explained to the 7 young people gathered around the table, is whether a decision serves just your immediate interests or whether it serves the long-term health of the entire community. My mentor, Lydia Harrow, used to say that a ranch this size only survives if the valley around it thrives. That principle has guided every major decision I've made for 30 years. But doesn't that sometimes mean leaving money on the table? Asked one of the fellows, a young man named James who'd grown up in poverty, so crushing it made Ethan's early circumstances look comfortable by comparison. Always, Ethan confirmed. There are dozens of ways I could increase short-term profits by charging more for water access, by taking advantage when neighbors are desperate, by prioritizing this ranch's interests above community stability. Every single one of those strategies would be financially rational in the short term, and every single one would ultimately destroy what makes this operation sustainable. Because you'd breed resentment, Maria said, understanding dawning on her face. You'd turn cooperation into competition, trust into suspicion. Exactly. The water rights Lydia's father established weren't just about legal control. They were about building a network of mutual dependence and mutual support. When the Dawsons' barn burned, we helped rebuild it not out of charity, but because their survival strengthened the entire valley's economy. When Henderson couldn't pay his fees, we worked out terms rather than crushing him, because destroying one rancher would signal to everyone else that we couldn't be trusted to deal fairly in difficult times. The discussion continued for hours, ranging across topics that had little to do with ranching and everything to do with the kind of leaders these young people would become. Some would stay with Harrow Ranch, eventually taking over operations when Ethan was ready to step back. Others would establish their own enterprises, carrying the principles they'd learned into new contexts and new industries. But all of them, Ethan hoped, would carry forward the essential lesson, that power and resources weren't ends in themselves, but tools for building something larger, something that created opportunity and dignity for people who'd been denied both by circumstances beyond their control. Late that night, alone in his office, Ethan pulled out a photograph he'd kept for 3 decades, a picture taken at Lydia's funeral, showing him standing beside her grave looking young and overwhelmed and determined all at once. He barely recognized that version of himself, that 20-year-old boy who'd inherited an empire and had no idea whether he could manage it successfully. But the core of who he'd been remained unchanged. He was still the person who'd stopped on a trading post porch, who'd made a choice that cost him everything and gained him more than he could measure. That choice had defined everything that followed, not because it was particularly heroic or extraordinary, but because it demonstrated something Lydia had been searching for, character that operated independently of consequences, that did right because doing wrong felt intolerable, regardless of what it cost. The years continued their relentless march. The Harrow Fellowship expanded further, establishing satellite programs in other territories, creating a network of ethically minded business leaders who understood that individual success depended on community health. The ranch itself evolved, adapting to changing markets and technologies while maintaining the foundational principles that had sustained it for nearly a century. And then, on a cold February afternoon, 45 years after he'd first arrived at Harrow Ranch, Ethan found himself back at that same trading post building. It had been restored beautifully, transformed from a crumbling relic into a vibrant community center that served as the valley's gathering place. The porch where he'd seen Lydia sitting in confusion so many years ago now hosted meetings and celebrations, its boards solid and its paint fresh. He'd come for the dedication ceremony, but had arrived early, wanting a moment alone with memories that seemed both impossibly distant and startlingly immediate. He sat on that porch in almost the exact spot where Lydia had sat, watching the street where people once passed without stopping, without seeing, without caring. The town had changed dramatically. Where Redstone Hollow had once been fading into irrelevance, it was now thriving, rebuilt on an economy strengthened by the ranch's community investment philosophy. Buildings that had been abandoned stood restored and occupied. Streets that had been empty bustled with activity. The entire valley had transformed, built on foundations of fair dealing and mutual support that Lydia's father had established, and that Ethan had worked 45 years to maintain and expand. "Mr. Cole?" A voice interrupted his reverie. Ethan looked up to see a young man standing at the bottom of the porch steps, hesitant and uncertain. The boy couldn't have been more than 18, dressed in clothes that had seen better days, his face showing the kind of weariness that came from too much hardship too early in life. "Can I help you?" Ethan asked, though something in the boy's posture already told him the answer. "I heard there's a program," the boy said, "the Harrow Fellowship. I heard they help people who need a chance but don't have connections or money or—" He trailed off, looking embarrassed and desperate in equal measure, the same expression Ethan had probably worn at 19 when desperation overrode pride. "They do," Ethan confirmed gently. "Tell me your story." The boy's name was Marcus, a coincidence that made Ethan smile, and his circumstances were achingly familiar. Parents dead, no family support, working day labor jobs that barely kept him fed, trying to save enough to build some kind of future but losing ground with each passing month. Ethan listened without interrupting, seeing himself so clearly in this boy's desperation that it felt like looking through a window into the past. "The application process is competitive," Ethan said when Marcus finished. "We get hundreds of applicants each year and can only accept a few. But character matters more than credentials, and determination matters more than experience. If you're willing to work harder than you've ever worked, to learn everything we can teach you, to commit to principles that might cost you short-term gain for long-term purpose, then you have a real chance." "I'll do whatever it takes," Marcus said, and the fierce determination in his voice was so familiar it made Ethan's chest ache. "Then come to the ranch tomorrow morning," Ethan said. "We'll start the interview process. No promises, but you'll get a fair evaluation based on who you are, not where you've been." Marcus's face transformed with hope so pure it was almost painful to witness. "Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. I won't let you down." After the boy left, Ethan sat alone on the porch as the sun began its descent toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and crimson exactly as it had 45 years ago, when he'd made the choice that changed everything. The circle was completing itself. He'd been saved by kindness when he had nothing. He'd built a life and a legacy from that gift. And now he was positioned to offer the same chance to another desperate young person standing exactly where he'd stood, hoping for a miracle that seemed impossible but wasn't. Not if someone chose to stop, to see, to care. The dedication ceremony that followed was well attended, with speeches from local officials and community leaders praising the transformation the valley had undergone. But the moment that mattered most to Ethan came at the end, when he stood at the podium and looked out at faces representing 3 generations of people whose lives had been touched by the program Lydia had envisioned and he'd built. "This building represents a choice," Ethan said, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. 45 years ago, an elderly woman sat on this porch, confused and lost, watching people walk past without stopping. I almost walked past too. I had every practical reason to keep going, to prioritize my own immediate needs over a stranger's welfare. But I stopped. And that choice, that single moment of deciding that doing right mattered more than personal consequences, changed everything. What we've built here, what the Harrow Fellowship represents, is a commitment to creating more of those moments, to identifying people who demonstrate character when it costs them something, and giving them the resources and training to build lives that honor that character, to transforming isolated acts of kindness into systematic opportunity creation. This isn't about charity, it's about recognizing that our individual success depends on our community's health, that power means nothing if it's not used to lift others up, that the measure of a life isn't what you accumulate, but what you enable others to build. Lydia Harrow understood this. Her father understood this. And every person who's participated in this program, as a fellow, as a mentor, as a supporter, understands this. We're building something that will outlast all of us, something that creates opportunity and dignity for people who deserve both, but have been denied access by circumstances beyond their control. That's the legacy. That's what this building represents. Not the past, but the future we're creating together, one choice, one person, one opportunity at a time. The applause that followed felt like affirmation, not of him personally, but of the vision that had sustained this work for nearly half a century. As the crowd dispersed and people came forward to shake his hand and share their own stories of transformation, Ethan felt the weight of those 45 years lifting slightly. He'd done what Lydia asked. He'd passed forward what had been given to him, had transformed a personal miracle into a systematic program, had built something that would continue creating opportunities long after he was gone. The work wasn't finished. It would never be finished. But it was sustainable now, embedded in the valley's culture and economy in ways that would be difficult to erase. That evening, as the sun set and the community center emptied, Ethan walked back to his horse for the ride back to the ranch. He was 64 years old now, his body bearing the accumulated weight of decades of hard work, but his mind remained sharp and his purpose remained clear. Tomorrow, he'd interview young Marcus, would evaluate whether the boy's character and determination matched the desperation in his eyes. If Marcus passed the tests, if he demonstrated the qualities Lydia had seen in Ethan all those years ago, he'd be given a chance to build a future he couldn't access otherwise. And the circle would continue, rolling forward through generations, transforming individual acts of kindness into systematic change, proving that power and resources could be wielded ethically, that success didn't require sacrificing principles, that one person's choice to stop and help could cascade into transformation beyond anything they imagined. Ethan rode through the gathering darkness toward the ranch that had been his home for 45 years, toward the graves of the people who'd shaped him, toward the work that would continue until he could no longer do it, and someone else, someone he'd trained and mentored, someone who'd learned the lessons he'd learned, would take over and carry it forward. The stars emerged overhead, the same stars that had watched Lydia's father buy his first acres, that had seen Lydia defend and expand what he built, that had witnessed Ethan's transformation from desperate boy to the steward of a legacy measured in changed lives rather than accumulated wealth. And somewhere in Redstone Hollow, a young man named Marcus lay awake in whatever rough accommodation he could afford, hoping that tomorrow would bring the chance he desperately needed, unaware that he was standing at the same crossroads Ethan had stood at 45 years ago, that his future was about to transform in ways he couldn't imagine, that one choice on a trading post porch decades ago was still generating ripples that would touch his life and countless others. The story that had begun with an act of kindness continued, rolling forward through time, proving that character mattered, that principles could sustain themselves across generations, that the choice to stop and help when everyone else walked past wasn't just moral, it was the foundation of everything worth building. And in the end, that was all any life could hope to be. A bridge between what was given and what was passed forward, a link in a chain of opportunity and transformation that stretched backward into history and forward into a future built on the simple but revolutionary idea that people mattered more than profit, that community mattered more than individual gain, that the measure of success wasn't what you accumulated, but what you enabled others to become. Ethan Cole had learned that lesson on a trading post porch when he was 19 years old and had nothing. 45 years later, with wealth and power and influence beyond anything he'd imagined, the lesson remained unchanged and unchanging, the truest measure of a life well lived.